Before we get started, as many of you know, I keep these videos free of mid-roll ads deliberately, so nothing interrupts you while you're trying to sleep. If you enjoy the content and it helps you relax, and you'd like to support the channel, please consider becoming a channel member. It really helps the channel out. A massive shout out to Lexicon and Christine, our two current members. Seriously, thank you both. I really appreciate your support. With that said, let's get into the stories. Her browser was still open when I got there. That's the thing I keep starting with. I've tried starting with the day we met, or with the practical facts in the order they happened, but I always end up back at the browser, tab still open, screen still lit, her mug on the desk beside the keyboard with the tea still warm, and I remember thinking, in that first stupid second, that she must have just stepped out. She hadn't stepped out. Okay, I'll try to do this properly. Her name was Priya. She was 22. We were on the same English literature course at university. Second year when we met. Third year when everything happened. She was from Coventry originally. Her family still there. And she had that thing some people from the Midlands have where the warmth is completely real, but also completely undemonstrative, like it's just a baseline rather than an effort. She didn't perform friendliness. She was just friendly without making anything of it. We met at a seminar on early 20th century fiction that neither of us wanted to attend. Sat next to each other by chance. Ended up walking to the library afterwards. Ended up in the cafe attached to the library because neither of us actually needed anything from the library. Talked for 2 hours. I walked back to my flat that afternoon thinking I'd made a friend, which doesn't happen that often when you're 20 and new somewhere and not entirely sure how to be around people you don't yet know. She was the best reader I've ever met. That's a strange thing to say about someone maybe. But if you do English literature, you know what I mean. Some people read books, and some people read books. Priya read them like they were evidence of something. Like she was trying to work out what the author was concealing by looking at what they'd chosen to say. She told me once that she'd wanted to be a barrister before she ended up on the literature course. And you could feel that in how she approached everything. This assumption that the surface wasn't the whole story, that understanding something meant getting underneath it. She was funny, quietly funny, the kind that sneaks up on you. She made observations about people and situations that were accurate in an almost uncomfortable way, and she delivered them with a completely straight face. And then she'd give you this look when you laughed as if she was mildly surprised you'd caught it. I loved her. Not romantically. I want to be clear about that. Not because it matters to the story, but because I'm aware that bereaved friend narratives get assumed into romance, and this wasn't that. It was the kind of friendship that in different circumstances might have lasted 40 years. The kind where the other person becomes part of how you think, where you find yourself formulating observations you want to share with them before you've realized you're doing it. Present tense, that last bit. I'm aware. I'm going to describe what I found because I've been told, by the counselor I've been seeing, that describing things is part of the process. I'm not sure I believe that, actually. I think describing things is sometimes just describing things, but I'll do it anyway. I had a key to her flat because we'd been swapping keys since second year just in case. Lost keys. Locked out situations, the practical logistics of being close to someone in a city where you don't have family nearby. I used the key on a Tuesday afternoon in March because she'd missed a seminar that morning, which she never did, and wasn't answering her phone. I knocked first, obviously. Then I used the key. The flat was a one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a converted house about 15 minutes from campus. it always smelled of the particular candle she burned when she was working. Something with cedar in it, I never knew the name. It smelled of that when I came in. Music was playing from somewhere, low, from her laptop, speakers probably. The kind of ambient music she put on when she was reading, not music with words. The bedroom door was open. There are things I'm not going to describe. I mean that, not as coyness or evasion, but as a genuine statement about capacity. There are images from that afternoon that I have described once to the police, in a room with recording equipment and a woman who was professionally equipped to receive that kind of description. And I said what needed to be said, and I haven't said it since, and I'm not going to say it here. What I will say is that what had been done to Priya had taken time, deliberate time, that what I saw was the result of something sustained and methodical, something that had not been quick, and that the evidence of that was not possible to misread. I rang 999. I went into the hallway, and I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, and I waited. While I waited, I looked at her browser. The laptop was on the desk in the corner, still lit, still running. The tab that was open was not something I could look away from immediately, even though looking at it was the wrong instinct. My brain was trying to understand what had happened, and it went toward information rather than away from it. That's how I found out what I found out. I should say that what follows took me months to piece together. The evening of... I wasn't in a state to understand anything. I was in shock, which sounds like a cliche and is apparently a real and specific neurological state that I have since read about, because understanding things is how I cope with them, or how I try to. Shock involves a narrowing of cognitive function and a disruption to the consolidation of new memories, and that describes that Tuesday fairly accurately. What I know from the police investigation, from conversations with detectives over the following months, from what I was eventually shown and told, and from my own memory of the browser screen that I've returned to and examined and re-examined until I'm fairly confident I know what was on it. What was on it was a stream, not a recording, a live stream, or what had been a live stream. It had ended. The interface was still open, a dark-bordered player on a dark background site, the kind of layout that doesn't want to be found by ordinary means. The stream had ended according to the timestamp, approximately 40 minutes before I arrived. The player was static, but the tab was still open, the way tabs stay open when no one closes them, the way things stay exactly where they were when someone last touched them. Priya had not been watching the stream. She had been in it. I need to stop here for a second. I'm aware that the previous sentence is just sitting there. I wrote it, and then I stopped writing for a while and did other things. Made tea, looked out the window at the street, checked my phone for something to look at. That wasn't this. I do that a lot. My attention goes sideways when I get close to the center of it. The counselor says that's normal. The counselor says a lot of things are normal that don't feel normal, which I suppose is the point. What I was going to say, before I went sideways, is that the reconstruction of what happened, how it happened, how she ended up in that stream, who was responsible, that reconstruction took a long time and is still, in some parts, incomplete. What the police established was this. The site on her browser was a platform operating in a part of the internet that required specific access to reach. It hosted live streams of real harm. The streams were ticketed, access paid for in advance, participants receiving a link at a specified time. The streams were advertised in advance on associated forums with descriptions of the content and the subject. Multiple people had watched what happened to Priya in real time. The viewing figures were in the investigation file. I was told the number once and I won't repeat it. It's a number that has changed how I think about most things. How Priya came to be connected to this. Whether she had stumbled onto it, whether someone she knew had connections to it, whether she had been identified and targeted through her online activity, is something the investigation addressed without fully resolving. There was evidence she had been in contact in the weeks before with someone she believed to be a fellow literature student at another university. The contact had been through an academic forum, reasonable and plausible, the kind of connection students make all the time. The person she'd been in contact with was not a literature student. Beyond that, I have been told to wait for conclusions that keep not arriving. I keep thinking about the barrister's thing. What she'd said about wanting to be a barrister. The way she read everything as evidence of something being concealed. She was better at getting underneath surfaces than almost anyone I've known, and she still didn't see it. That's not fair. That's me being angry in the wrong direction. She was 22 and trusting, and had no reason to apply that analytical attention to someone who presented as a peer, a fellow reader, a person who was interested in the same thing she was. The cruelty of it is precisely that what was used against her was the genuine, specific, particular person she was, her intelligence, her interests, her assumption that someone engaging seriously with literature was probably trustworthy. They found a way in through who she actually was. There's a seminar I attended last term, month or so after everything. I don't know why I went. Inertia, maybe. Or the alternative was sitting in my flat. It was on Victorian sensation fiction, the kind of novels built around concealed secrets, around what is hidden in plain sight, around the gap between surfaces and what's underneath. Priya would have loved it. She would have had things to say that made everyone else reconsider what they'd read. I sat in the back and listened and said nothing, and looked at the chair she would have sat in and thought about absolutely nothing for most of an hour, which is the closest to peace I've found since March. I'm still on the course. People ask if I'm okay, and I say yes, more or less, which is approximately true on the days when it is, and a necessary fiction on the days when it isn't. I function. I hand things in. The work is harder than it was, because I can't read anything now without hearing her voice reading it alongside me. And sometimes that's unbearable, and sometimes it's the only thing that makes the work feel like it matters. Her family are in Coventry. Her mum rang me once, a few months after. We talked for a long time. I can't write about that conversation. Some things are not mine to share, and that's one of them. I'll just say that her mum sounded like her. The same quality in the voice, the same warmth that didn't perform itself, and that I understood from that conversation where Priya had learned to be the person she was, and that the loss expanded in that conversation to a size I hadn't fully understood it was. The investigation is ongoing. I'm told this regularly. I believe it in the sense that I have no reason not to, and I question it in the sense that ongoing investigations are a long way from concluded ones, and I try not to think too much about the gap between what the police can do and what the site is probably continuing to do, because that gap is very large and thinking about it doesn't close it. The cedar candle smell. I noticed it when I came in that afternoon, and I've never been able to separate it from what I found, and I haven't been able to be in a room where that scent is burning since. I know that's the brain doing what the brain does, associating things that happen together, protecting you from re-exposure. I know it's neurologically explicable. It doesn't help much, but it's something to hold on to. That there are explanations for the stranger parts of how this has landed in me. That I'm not just randomly falling apart, that the falling apart has a shape. The browser, still open, the tea still warm. I think about the 40 minutes, between the stream ending and me arriving, what those 40 minutes were, who was doing what in them, whether she was already gone or whether she was. I stopped there. I stop there every time. I don't have enough information to complete that thought accurately, and I've learned slowly that completing it inaccurately doesn't serve anything. She was 22. She wanted to be a barrister. She read books like they were evidence of something concealed. She was right about that. She was right about almost everything. I just wish she'd been wrong about people. "4 minutes. That's how long I watched it before I closed the laptop. I've been sitting with that fact for over a year now, and I still don't know exactly what it says about me, but I know it doesn't say anything good. I'm going to try and explain how I ended up there. Not to excuse it, just because the how matters, I think. It matters because the way it happens is never the way you'd imagine it happening. You don't make a single, obvious wrong decision. You make 100 small, almost invisible ones, and then you're somewhere you can't entirely explain. We'd had a break-in. That's where it started. Not at our house, at a neighbor's 3 doors down. A couple in their 60s, semi-retired. Someone had come through their back gate on a Wednesday afternoon while they were both out. Took a laptop, some cash from a kitchen drawer, a small jewelry box from the bedroom. The sort of burglary the police take a statement about and then don't pursue, because they know exactly where the odds sit, and so do you. Our neighbor, the husband, he told me about it over the fence one Sunday, and I could hear in the way he described it that the thing that had really shaken him wasn't the stuff that was taken. It was the idea of someone moving through his kitchen, opening his drawers, standing in his bedroom. He kept coming back to that detail. The bedroom. I went home that afternoon and started looking at home security cameras. Straightforward enough. I wanted something that covered the back of our house and the alley that ran behind the terrace. My wife thought I was overreacting. Maybe I was. But I went down that particular rabbit hole with some thoroughness over the following couple of weeks. Comparison sites, review forums, YouTube walkthroughs of different systems. And somewhere in that process, as tends to happen when you spend long enough looking for something specific on the internet, I started encountering other things, adjacent things, forums where people discuss security more broadly, what the police could and couldn't do with residential footage, how footage got retrieved after incidents, what investigators actually looked for, and somewhere in that chain. I genuinely couldn't retrace the exact steps now. I ended up reading about private investigation marketplaces. Not anything sinister at first. Legitimate seeming services. People offering to trace addresses, verify identities, that kind of thing. Some of it clearly legal, some of it in a grayer area. And from there, because curiosity doesn't stop when it should, I started looking at where those services crossed over into places the regular internet didn't host. That's how I ended up on the dark web for the first time. 43 years old, secondary school geography teacher, semi-detached in Nottingham. Not someone who'd have described himself as the type. I want to be careful here about not making it sound more purposeful than it was. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I had no agenda. I was just, and I know this sounds inadequate, interested in how far down it went, what the actual geography of it was. I'd read the same articles everyone reads, and I wanted to see it for myself. The way you might read about a place and feel a vague compulsion to go there, even knowing there's nothing there for you. The first few sessions were unremarkable, bleak in places, disturbing in patches, but not the visceral horror that journalism tends to imply. A lot of it was dreary. A lot of it was clearly either fake or performative. People trying to seem more dangerous than they were. I browsed cautiously, touched nothing, gave nothing away. I was, as I'd been telling myself almost constantly, just looking. The camera forums were what pulled me back. And I say forums loosely. They weren't discussion boards exactly. They were more like listing hubs. People offering access to feeds, selling footage, that sort of thing. I'd stumbled onto one while following a link about security system vulnerabilities, which had felt, at the time, directly relevant to what I'd originally been researching. See how that works. See how clean the justification feels right up until it doesn't. Most of the feeds being offered were either clearly fabricated or so degraded in quality they were barely watchable. Some were security camera angles that looked genuinely unmodified. Car parks, stairwells, the corners of warehouses, and carried a different kind of unease. Not because of what they showed, but because somewhere someone had gained access to a camera they had no right to and was selling that access like a commodity. I found that disturbing in a way I couldn't entirely look away from, the way you slow down passing an accident. I went back 4 or 5 times over a couple of weeks. I want to be precise about how that progression felt, because it wasn't uniform. The first return was almost academic. I told myself I was going back to understand the structure of the site better, to confirm what I'd seen was what I thought it was. The second time, I stayed longer than the first and felt worse leaving. By the third or fourth visit, something had shifted, and I was no longer pretending I was there for any reason other than the one I didn't want to name. Each time I closed the laptop, I sat with a residue that took longer to clear. That's the mechanism of it. You don't stay because you want to. You stay because leaving feels like an active decision, and staying just feels like not having left yet. And each time you go back, the threshold for going back has already been lowered by the fact that you went back before. The listing I found on the 5th or 6th visit looked, at first, like others I'd seen. It was titled simply, something like Residential East Midlands, Ongoing, and the thumbnail was low resolution and dark. A room. Interior. I assumed it was another case of someone selling access to a poorly secured home camera, the kind of thing you could apparently set up accidentally with a cheap off-brand system and the wrong default settings. I clicked through, and what I saw wasn't an accidental feed. The image was clear, much clearer than most. A living room, ordinary in every detail, sofa, television, a low bookshelf, the corner of a dining table, natural light coming from the left side, meaning a window just off frame. The angle was from high up, which told you the camera was either mounted near the ceiling or placed on a high shelf, and it was fixed and stable in a way that a phone prop somewhere wouldn't be. Someone had installed a camera in this room deliberately, and they had done it with enough care that it wasn't visible in the frame. There was no timestamp, but the daylight suggested daytime, and the room was occupied. A woman was sitting on the sofa. She had her back partly to the camera, angled towards the television, and she had her legs drawn up beneath her in the way people sit when they're comfortable and not expecting to be looked at. She was wearing a grey jumper, sleeves pushed up to the elbows. She was reading something, a phone or possibly a small tablet, and the quality of the image was good enough that I could see her moving her thumb up the screen occasionally. At one point, she tilted her head slightly, the way you do when something you've read catches you, and then went still again. She had no idea she was being filmed. There was nothing in her posture, nothing in the unhurried way she sat, that suggested anything other than a person alone in their own home on an ordinary afternoon, existing in the private way people do when they believe no one is watching. At some point during those 4 minutes, a mug on the coffee table in front of her sent up a thin curl of steam. That's the image I come back to more than any other. Not her face. I never saw that clearly. Just the steam rising from the mug, steady and completely ordinary, while somewhere on the other side of a dark web, listing a stranger sat and watched. I've tried to reconstruct exactly what was passing through my mind in those 4 minutes, and the honest answer is not enough. There's a delay between seeing something and understanding what it is you're actually looking at. And in that delay, I just watch, the way you might watch anything on a screen, because screens have a way of making everything feel like content. It took an embarrassingly long time for the full weight of it to land, that this was someone's home, that she had no idea, that by not closing the laptop, I was participating in something that had been done to her without her knowledge or consent. By the time I finally did close it, my hands were unsteady and I felt something in my chest that wasn't quite nausea, but was close enough to matter. I closed the laptop and went and stood in the kitchen for a while. My wife was upstairs. I could hear her moving around. I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the back garden and tried to think through what I'd just seen with some degree of clarity. The camera in that room hadn't got there by accident. Someone had entered that house or had access to it, had some reason to be there, and had installed a device, concealed it, and then set up a way to broadcast or record the feed. Then they'd listed it, priced it, offered it to whoever found their way to that particular corner of the dark web and had the inclination to pay. I didn't know how many people had viewed it. I didn't know how long the listing had been up. I didn't know where in the East Midlands it was, or whether the East Midlands description was even accurate. I also didn't know who the woman was, but I could see her clearly enough to describe her. And I kept thinking, uselessly, circularly, about the fact that at some point she'd get up from that sofa and make a cup of tea, or go upstairs, or do any of the things people do in the privacy of their own homes, and the camera would be there for all of it. The question of what to do sat with me for days, in a way that was genuinely immobilizing. I'd have to explain where I'd seen it. I'd have to explain what I'd been doing on the dark web and why. And I'd have to do that to a police officer. And the version of events I'd tell would include the 4 minutes. Because leaving that out felt like the kind of a mission that compounds everything. My wife didn't know I'd been going on there. Nobody did. I waited longer than I should have. About 2 weeks. I kept half convincing myself that the listing would have been taken down, that someone else would have reported it, that the problem would resolve itself in the way that problems sometimes do when you're too cowardly to resolve them yourself. None of that happened, as far as I knew. What did happen was that I went back once, just once, to check whether the listing was still there. It was, and it had grown. There were now 3 thumbnails alongside the original living room. A bedroom, the same high-mounted angle, the same deliberate framing, a bed with the covers pulled back on one side, a wardrobe door left slightly open, a bathroom, the image darker, the camera positioned in a way that took me a moment to understand, and then made me close my eyes briefly when I did, and a 4th thumbnail I hadn't expected. The front of the house, exterior, taken from the street, just the facade. A parked car visible at the edge of the frame. The house number above the door, clear enough to read. That last one was what made the floor feel uncertain beneath me. The living room feed was violation enough, but the exterior shot, the house number, meant that whoever was running this listing wasn't just selling footage, they were selling location. They were offering anyone who paid enough not just access to her rooms, but the means to find the building those rooms were inside. I closed the laptop before I'd fully processed what I was looking at. I'd been on the page for perhaps 30 seconds. but I sat at the desk for a long time afterwards, and the feeling wasn't the dull, residual discomfort of the previous visits. It was sharper than that. It was the specific, nauseating understanding that whatever this was, it had escalated since I'd first found it, and I had spent 2 weeks doing nothing while it escalated. I went to the police the following morning. I walked into the station on Canal Street and told them I needed to report something, and when the officer asked me what it related to, I said it related to surveillance footage. Being distributed without someone's knowledge or consent, I'd rehearsed the phrase. It sounded cleaner than what it was. The process that followed was both more and less than I'd expected. A detective came to the house 2 days later, a man younger than me, who took notes on a laptop and asked specific questions without much expression. He wanted to know the exact URL, the structure of the listing, what I'd seen, how I'd found it. He asked, at one point, whether I'd had any direct contact with whoever posted the listing, and I said no, and he wrote that down without comment in a way that felt like its own kind of assessment. He wasn't rude. He was just thorough in a way that made everything feel documented. He told me at the end that they'd be treating it seriously, that this type of offense, covert recording distributed for commercial purposes, carried significant penalties if someone was identified and charged. He mentioned that locating the victim, if she hadn't already come forward independently, would be a priority. He didn't tell me anything about how they'd go about any of it, or what the realistic chances were, or what any of it would produce. He thanked me for coming forward. He let himself out. I've not heard anything since. That was over a year ago. I don't know whether they found her. I don't know whether, if they found her, she knew. Whether they'd had to tell her that there was a camera in her living room, her bedroom, her bathroom, and that footage from it had been offered for sale to strangers on the dark web. I think about what that conversation would feel like, being told that, the particular violation of it. Your own home, the one place that's supposed to be unconditionally yours, turned into something else without your knowledge. I also think about the person who installed those cameras, who they were in relation to her. You don't put a camera in someone's living room from a distance. You have to be inside the house to do it, which means the person who did this had been invited in, or had a key, or had let themselves in. A partner, an ex-partner, a landlord, a tradesman, someone she trusted enough to let through her front door. That's the detail I can't move past. Not the dark web listing, not the footage, not any of the specific things I saw. It's the fact that whoever did this had stood in that room, looked up at the ceiling or across at the high shelf or wherever the camera ended up, and decided where to put it, had thought about angles and coverage and what would and wouldn't be in frame, had done all of that while she was somewhere else in the house, or while she was out, or while they were supposed to be fixing the boiler or painting the skirting board or doing whatever it was she'd let them in to do. I unboxed our home security cameras about a month after all of this, and my wife asked why I'd gone off the idea. I said I'd read some things about data privacy and wasn't sure the particular brand stored footage securely. She accepted that. I've never told her the real reason. It's partly that the whole episode still embarrasses me. The dark web browsing, the 4 minutes, the 2 weeks I spent not doing anything. But it's also something more specific than embarrassment. It's that I now know what a camera in a room looks like from the inside of the footage. I know the angle. I know the quality. And every time I walk into my own living room, I find myself looking briefly at the high corners, the tops of shelves, the spaces just above the door frame. I've never found anything. Of course I haven't. There's no reason there would be anything. But the looking has become a reflex now, and I can't seem to stop it. And what I'm really checking for every time is whether someone has stood in my house and done to me what someone did to her. That's what I tell myself it is anyway. The habit of checking. The small involuntary question of whether someone has been here and decided where to put the camera while I was somewhere else. About 6 months after I reported it, I did one final search. Not for the listing itself, I wasn't going back there. Just for any news coverage that might tell me whether someone had been charged, whether she'd been found, whether any of it had amounted to anything. I didn't find that. What I did find, on a thread in a corner of the ordinary internet where people discuss this kind of thing, was a post describing the listing in enough detail that I knew immediately it was the same one. The high-angle living room, the East Midlands location, the exterior shot with the house number. Someone had written it up in the flat, almost clinical way people use when they're trying to seem detached from something that has clearly unsettled them. The post was dated 4 months after I'd gone to the police. 4 months after I'd sat across a desk and given a detective the URL, the structure, everything I could remember. The listing had still been up. I've thought about what that means, whether the report went nowhere, whether the site moved faster than any investigation could, whether she's still living in that house without knowing. I don't have answers to any of it. I probably never will. What I have instead is the steam rising from the mug. That image, sitting in the place where a resolution should be. A woman alone in her living room on an ordinary afternoon, completely at ease, while somewhere out there, the number above her front door was available to anyone willing to pay for it. That's the part that doesn't leave. Not what I saw, what she didn't know. There's something about being a creature of habit that feels comforting, isn't there? Knowing what you'll be doing on any given day, following the same routes, stopping at the same places, the predictability of it all. I used to think that made life easier, more manageable. I'd wake up at the same time each morning, take the same walk before breakfast, go through the same routines that had developed naturally over years of living alone. It felt safe, I suppose, structured. The kind of life where you don't have to think too hard about what comes next, because you've done it all 100 times before. I'm an occupational therapist, working with elderly clients at their homes across Hull and the surrounding areas. It's rewarding work, helping people maintain independence in their daily lives, adapting their environments to make things easier as mobility or cognitive function declines. I've been doing it for around 14 years now, long enough that I've developed quite set patterns in how I structure my days. I visit the same clients on the same days each week, take the same routes between appointments, stop at the same cafe for lunch most days because I know what I'll get, and it's convenient. I live in a terraced house near the city centre. Bought it about 8 years ago when property prices were still reasonable. It's a nice enough area, quiet street, neighbours I recognise, but don't really know beyond polite nods when we're putting bins out. I've lived alone since I bought the place, prefer it that way honestly. After spending days helping people navigate challenging situations, there's something restorative about coming home to space that's entirely your own, where you can be completely yourself without having to maintain any professional demeanour. My routines at home are as predictable as my work schedule. Morning walk at 6:30. Same route around the nearby park regardless of weather. Coffee from the same shop on the corner before I start seeing clients. Home by 6 most evenings, dinner around 7. Usually something simple because I'm tired from the day. Television for an hour or so, then bed by 10 because I need proper sleep to function effectively in my job. Weekends follow their own patterns. Saturday morning shopping at the same supermarket, Sunday afternoon walk along the marina, that sort of thing. I never thought about how visible these routines were to anyone paying attention. Never occurred to me that predictability could be a vulnerability rather than just a comfort. Why would it? I'm not particularly wealthy, don't own anything especially valuable, live a quiet, unremarkable life helping elderly people maintain theirs. There's nothing about me that would make anyone think I'm worth paying attention to. Nothing that would suggest I'm a target for anything more serious than maybe an opportunistic burglary. But apparently, that's not how these things work. Apparently, the very ordinariness of my life, the predictability of my routines, the fact that I live alone and follow the same patterns week after week, all of that made me exactly the sort of person someone was looking for. Not for anything I owned or any particular reason related to who I am, but simply because my life was documented and consistent enough to be useful to people I'd never meet, who had purposes I couldn't have imagined. It started, as far as I can tell, about 18 months ago, though I didn't know anything was happening at the time. I was just living my normal life, following my comfortable routines, completely unaware that someone was systematically documenting every aspect of my daily patterns. Where I went, when I went there, how long I stayed, what routes I took between locations. All of it recorded with precision that seems excessive until you understand what it was being used for. I first became aware something might be wrong when a colleague mentioned she'd seen me in a part of town I don't usually visit. She said she'd waved, but I hadn't seemed to notice, which was odd, because I'm generally quite observant about my surroundings. The problem was, I hadn't been in that area on the day she mentioned. I'd been visiting clients on the opposite side of the city, following my usual Thursday schedule. When I explained this, she seemed confused, but we both shrugged it off as a case of mistaken identity. Then it happened again, a few weeks later. A former client's daughter mentioned seeing me at the marina on a Sunday morning, said she'd been surprised because she knew I usually went there in the afternoons. Again, I hadn't been there that morning. I'd been at home doing housework, my typical Sunday morning routine. This time, the coincidence felt less comfortable, but I still assumed it was just someone who looked similar to me, being spotted in places I was known to frequent. The third incident was more unsettling. My neighbor, an older woman who lives 2 doors down and who I occasionally chat with when we're both outside, mentioned that she'd seen someone in my back garden late one evening. She'd been letting her cat out and noticed a figure standing near my back door, looking at the windows. She'd assumed it was me initially, but then realized the person was wearing different clothes than she'd seen me in earlier that day. By the time she thought to say something, the figure had left. That conversation made me properly uneasy. Someone in my garden, specifically, examining my windows. That wasn't a case of mistaken identity or coincidental resemblance. That was someone deliberately on my property, potentially trying to work out how to access my house. I checked all my locks that evening, made sure windows were secure, but I couldn't see any evidence of attempted entry or damage. I reported it to the police, more to have it documented than because I expected them to do much about it. They were sympathetic but honest about the limitations. Someone standing in a garden isn't itself a crime unless they're attempting to enter the property or causing damage, and by the time my neighbor mentioned it, whoever it was had long since left. They said they'd increase patrols in the area and advised me to contact them immediately if I noticed any further suspicious activity. Nothing obvious happened for a few weeks after that, and I started to relax slightly. Perhaps it had been someone genuinely confused about which house they were trying to visit, or a would-be burglar who'd moved on to easier targets after seeing my neighbor watching. I convinced myself it was an isolated incident that wouldn't be repeated. Then I started noticing small changes around my house. Nothing dramatic, just minor details that seemed slightly off. A plant pot on my back step moved a few inches from where I'd left it. The gate to my garden unlatched when I was certain I'd secured it. A bin moved from its usual position against the side wall. Each incident was small enough to dismiss as wind or cats or my own faulty memory, but together they created a pattern that felt deliberate. I became more vigilant, paying attention to exactly how I left things so I could be certain if they'd been disturbed. The disturbances continued, not frequently, maybe once a week or so, but consistent enough that I couldn't dismiss them as coincidence or imagination. Someone was accessing my garden regularly, moving small things, making their presence known in subtle ways. I installed a camera covering the back garden, one of those basic motion-activated security cameras that uploads footage to your phone. For the first few days, it showed nothing unusual. Just cats passing through, birds landing on the fence, the occasional fox at night. Then on the fourth night, around 2 a.m, it captured someone entering my garden through the back gate. The figure was dressed in dark clothes and moved carefully, checking the camera's position before doing anything else. They spent several minutes examining my back door and windows, trying handles, apparently checking if anything was unlocked. When everything proved secure, they took photographs of the locks and windows with their phone, taking their time to capture multiple angles. Then they left as quietly as they'd arrived, closing the gate carefully behind them. I took the footage to the police immediately. This time they treated it more seriously. Clear evidence of someone attempting to access my property, photographing security measures, behavior that suggested planning for future criminal activity. They assigned someone to investigate and asked if anything else unusual had happened recently. I mentioned the sightings of someone who looked like me in various locations, which I'd previously dismissed as a mistaken identity. The detective's expression changed when I mentioned that. She asked for specific details about when and where these sightings had occurred, who had seen me, what I'd been wearing according to witnesses. She seemed particularly interested in the timing and locations, making notes about my usual routines and when the supposed sightings had happened. A few days later, she contacted me again, asking if I'd be willing to let them check my house for surveillance equipment. That suggestion was disturbing in a way the garden intrusions hadn't been. The possibility that I'd been watched inside my own home without knowing it, that my private life had been observed and recorded. I agreed immediately, needing to know if my home had been compromised beyond just the external security concerns. The search took several hours. Specialists went through every room with detection equipment, checking for hidden cameras or recording devices. They found 3, one in my living room smoke detector, one hidden in the kitchen extractor fan, and one in my bedroom ceiling light. All of them had been in place for at least several months, recording and transmitting footage continuously. The detective explained what they believed was happening, though even now I struggle to fully comprehend it. My routines had been documented and sold on the dark web as part of what they called a comprehensive identity package. The surveillance footage, the photographs of me in various locations, detailed notes about my schedule and habits. All of it compiled into a profile that could be purchased by people interested in assuming someone else's identity, at least temporarily. The person who looked like me, who'd been spotted in various locations around Hull, had apparently purchased my identity profile. They'd studied my routines, my appearance, my typical clothing and behavior, until they could convincingly impersonate me in casual situations where detailed scrutiny wasn't likely. The sightings that had been reported to me were probably test runs, checking if they could pass as me in familiar locations without being challenged. The detective showed me the dark web marketplace where my profile was listed. It was organized like a professional service database, with categories for different types of identity profiles. People with established routines, predictable schedules, lives that could be temporarily borrowed for various purposes. My listing was categorized under solitary professionals with consistent patterns and minimal social oversight. The profile included everything someone would need to impersonate me convincingly in non-intimate situations. Photographs showing my appearance from multiple angles, including shots taken from the surveillance footage in my home. Detailed documentation of my daily routines, what I wore on different occasions, where I went and when. Notes about my mannerisms and behavior patterns based on analysis of the surveillance footage. Even information about my clients and work schedule, apparently gathered from observing my comings and goings over several months. The listing emphasized the stability and predictability of my routines, marketing that as valuable for buyers who needed to assume someone's identity for extended periods. It mentioned that I lived alone with minimal family contact, making me less likely to be immediately missed if someone was using my identity elsewhere. It noted that my work involved visiting clients independently, providing legitimate reasons for my presence in various locations at different times. The purchase history showed my profile had been bought by 4 different accounts. The detective explained that these profiles were valuable for various criminal purposes, creating alibis, accessing locations under false pretenses, evading law enforcement by using another person's identity and routine. Someone who looked reasonably similar to me could use my identity profile to be seen in places whilst crimes were being committed elsewhere, or to access locations they'd otherwise have no legitimate reason to visit. She walked me through what they'd learned about the impersonations that had occurred. The person my colleague had seen wasn't me, but someone using my profile who'd been establishing that they could pass as me in public. The sighting at the marina had been another test, checking if they could match my routine closely enough that people who knew me casually would mistake them for me. These weren't random acts. They were systematic preparation for using my identity for purposes I still don't fully understand. The investigation revealed a substantial operation. Hundreds of people had their routines documented and identity profiles created without their knowledge. Surveillance equipment installed during legitimate service visits or through other forms of access. Detailed observation of daily patterns over months or years. All of it compiled into profiles sold to people who needed to borrow someone else's identity temporarily for criminal purposes. The person caught in my garden on camera had been updating my profile with current information about my security measures. The marketplace offered profile refreshes as an additional service. Buyers could pay for updated intelligence if they needed current information, rather than potentially outdated details from when the profile was first created. The cameras in my house had been providing ongoing footage that kept my profile current and valuable. Several arrests were made, including the person who'd been caught on camera in my garden. But the identity profiles themselves had been widely distributed before law enforcement discovered the operation. My profile, along with hundreds of others, existed in private collections of people who downloaded it before the marketplace was shut down. The detective couldn't tell me who the 4 buyers were or what they'd use my identity for, only that investigations were ongoing. I had all the surveillance equipment removed and upgraded every security measure I could afford. Changed my locks, installed proper cameras covering all approaches to my house, Started varying my routines deliberately to avoid being as predictable as I'd been. But the psychological damage was deeper than any physical security measure could address. Someone had been living as me, at least partially, walking through places I usually went, being seen by people who knew me, using my identity and routine for purposes I'd never know. My life had been borrowed without permission, my predictable patterns weaponized against me, my comfortable routines turned into vulnerabilities that strangers exploited for their own purposes. I moved house 6 months after discovering the identity profile, not just because of what had happened, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that someone still knew too much about my life there. My routines, my habits, my patterns, all of it documented in profiles that existed somewhere beyond my ability to control or delete. Even in a new location with deliberately varied patterns, I can't escape the knowledge that for months, someone studied me closely enough to impersonate me, that strangers borrowed my identity for purposes I'll never fully understand. The detective mentioned that this type of identity theft was increasingly common. Not financial identity theft, where someone uses your personal details to access accounts, but physical identity theft where someone becomes you in the real world for short periods. The dark web marketplaces facilitated this by providing detailed profiles of people with predictable, documented lives that could be temporarily borrowed. She explained that buyers often purchase multiple profiles, testing different identities in low-risk situations before using them for more serious purposes. My profile had been bought by 4 different accounts, meaning 4 separate people or groups had paid for detailed information about how to convincingly be me for limited periods, what they'd used it for, whether crimes had been committed under my identity, whether anyone had been harmed by someone pretending to be me. Those questions remained unanswered. I think about those 4 unknown buyers constantly. Who were they? Why did they need to borrow my identity specifically? What situations required them to appear to be a solitary occupational therapist with predictable routines living in Hull? Were they local, people I might have encountered without knowing they'd studied footage of me sleeping and going about my private life? Or were they from elsewhere, using my profile for purposes that required temporary presence in this area? The uncertainty is corrosive. Not knowing what my identity was used for, whether crimes were committed while someone appeared to be me, whether people I interact with now might have previously encountered someone impersonating me. My comfortable routines, which had felt safe and manageable, had actually made me vulnerable to exploitation I'd never imagined possible. I still work as an occupational therapist, still help elderly clients maintain their independence. But I've learned that the independence I valued in my own life, the solitary routines, the predictable patterns, the life structured around familiar habits, created vulnerabilities that sophisticated criminals could exploit systematically. My identity was documented, packaged, and sold to people who needed to be someone else temporarily. And I discovered this only because one of them made mistakes that led investigators to me. The profile exists somewhere still. Months of surveillance footage showing my most private moments, detailed documentation of my routines and habits, photographs and analysis that allow someone who looks vaguely similar to me to convincingly impersonate me in casual situations. That information is outdated now that I've moved and changed my patterns, but it still exists in collections I'll never access, potentially being shared through networks I can't monitor. That's what I think about now when I see people following predictable routines, living solitary lives structured around familiar habits. Not that they're living comfortably within patterns that suit them, but that they might be creating comprehensive profiles of themselves without knowing it. That their predictability might be observed and documented by people who see routine as valuable intelligence, who understand that the most comfortable lives are often the most vulnerable to this particular type of exploitation. I was a creature of habit, and that made me a perfect target for identity theft I didn't know existed. My routines were borrowed, my life was temporarily lived by strangers, my identity became a product sold to people whose purposes I'll never fully understand. And somewhere out there, detailed documentation of who I was and how I lived still exists. A permanent record of vulnerabilities I can never completely eliminate, no matter how much I change or how carefully I vary my patterns now. This happened about 10 months ago when I was living in Birmingham, working as a veterinary nurse at a small practice in Moseley. The job was demanding but rewarding, lots of long days, but I genuinely enjoyed the work. I'd been there for about 3 years, had a decent little flat near Cannon Hill Park, and life was generally ticking along without any major complications. I've never been particularly tech-savvy, but I'm not completely hopeless either. I can navigate the internet well enough, understand basic privacy settings, that sort of thing. So when I read an article about the dark web one evening, I wasn't entirely clueless about what it was. The article was talking about how journalists and activists used it to communicate safely in countries with oppressive governments, how it wasn't all illegal marketplaces and criminal activity, like the media often portrayed it. The article mentioned that ordinary people could access it fairly easily, that it wasn't this incredibly complex thing requiring specialist knowledge. Out of curiosity more than anything else, I looked into how to do it, found some straightforward instructions, followed them, and within maybe 20 minutes I was browsing this completely different version of the internet. Most of it was boring, honestly. Pages that wouldn't load properly, sites that looked like they'd been designed 15 years ago and never updated, broken links everywhere. I spent an hour or so clicking around, not finding anything particularly interesting. There were some marketplaces that looked obviously dodgy, a few discussion boards I had no interest in, and a lot of dead ends. Then I found something called the Witness program. It was listed on one of those directory pages that catalog dark websites. The description was brief. Help provide testimony for those who cannot speak for themselves. Confidential, anonymous, essential. When I clicked through, the page that loaded was plain but well designed. Black background, white text, a simple logo showing an eye. The homepage explained what the program was about, and it sounded genuinely noble. Essentially, it was a platform designed to collect witness testimonies about crimes and injustices that couldn't be reported through official channels. The site explained that many people around the world witnessed terrible things but couldn't come forward because of fear, corruption, lack of access to legitimate authorities, or various other reasons. The Witness program aimed to document these testimonies anonymously, creating a permanent record that could potentially be used for justice in the future. The site emphasized that witnesses remain completely anonymous. No real names, no identifying information, just accounts of what people had seen or experienced. The testimonies were stored securely and could be accessed by verified human rights organizations, journalists, and legal professionals who might be able to use them to build cases or expose wrongdoing. It all seemed legitimate and important. There was a button at the bottom. Submit your testimony. I didn't have anything to submit. I'd never witnessed any serious crimes or injustices. But I was curious about what the process looked like, so I clicked through anyway. A form appeared asking for basic information about the incident you wanted to report. Date, location, type of incident. A detailed description of what you witnessed. There were drop-down menus for categorizing the testimony, human rights violations, corruption, assault, theft, environmental crimes, and various other options. At the bottom was a field for providing contact information if you wanted to receive updates, though the site stressed this was entirely optional. I closed the form without filling anything in. I had nothing to report, and I wasn't going to make something up just to see how the system worked. But as I was about to close the browser, I noticed another link at the bottom of the page. Become a witness validator. I clicked it. The page explained that the program needed volunteers to help verify and categorize submitted testimonies. Because the system allowed anonymous submissions, there was a risk of false reports or spam. Validators would review testimonies, assess whether they seemed credible, and help organize them appropriately so they could be useful to the organizations that accessed them. The page stressed that validators never had access to identifying information about witnesses. Everything remained anonymous. Validators simply read testimonies and provided their assessment of credibility, completeness, and relevance. Each validation earned points, and volunteers who accumulated enough points could receive recognition for their contribution to documenting human rights abuses and supporting justice. It sounded like something I could actually help with. I had no useful skills for activism or advocacy, but I could read testimonies and provide honest assessments. It seemed like a small but meaningful way to contribute to something important. I registered using a temporary email address. The process was simple. A few questions about languages I spoke, regions I was familiar with, any relevant experience or knowledge. I put down English, UK, and mentioned my work as a veterinary nurse, since some testimonies might involve animal welfare. Then I submitted the registration and was taken to a dashboard. The interface was clean and straightforward. At the top was my point balance, 0. Below that was a list of pending testimonies waiting for validation. Each one showed a reference number, a date, and a brief category label. There were dozens of them. I clicked on the first one. The testimony appeared in a simple text box. It was written in English, describing an incident of workplace harassment. The person writing it explained they'd witnessed their manager verbally abusing an employee over several weeks, creating a hostile environment, but the company's HR department had dismissed complaints. The testimony was detailed and specific, including dates and descriptions of particular incidents. Below the testimony were several questions I needed to answer. Does this testimony appear credible? Yes, possibly unclear no. Is the testimony sufficiently detailed? Yes, partially no. Is the testimony relevant to the stated category? Yes, partially no. Does the testimony require follow-up or additional information? Yes, no. I read through the testimony again carefully. It seemed genuine. The details were consistent, the writing style was natural, and nothing about it raised obvious red flags. I marked it as credible, sufficiently detailed, and relevant. Didn't think it needed follow-up since the account was fairly complete. Then I submitted my validation. My point balance increased slightly. A new testimony appeared. This one was different. Written in broken English, describing what sounded like labor exploitation in a factory somewhere in Eastern Europe. The details were vague, the timeline unclear, but the emotional tone felt genuine. I marked it as possibly credible, partially detailed, relevant, but requiring additional information. Another testimony appeared, then another, then another. Most were fairly mundane, honestly. Workplace disputes, minor corruption, petty theft. Things that were unpleasant but not shocking. I spent maybe an hour going through them, providing my assessments, earning points slowly. Then I came across one that made me pause. The testimony described witnessing an assault, a serious one, with enough detail that it made me uncomfortable to read. The person writing it explained they'd seen someone being attacked in a car park late at night, that the victim had been badly hurt, and that the witness had been too frightened to intervene or report it to police. The testimony included descriptions of the attacker, the victim, the location, the approximate date. I sat staring at the screen for a while. This wasn't workplace harassment or minor corruption. This was a violent crime, and someone had witnessed it but hadn't reported it, and now they were telling their story to this anonymous platform instead. I marked it as credible, sufficiently detailed and relevant, added a note suggesting it should be flagged for organizations that dealt with violent crime. Then I submitted the validation and tried not to think too much about what I just read. I kept validating testimonies over the next few days. Did maybe an hour or two each evening, working through the backlog, earning points steadily. Most testimonies were relatively minor things, but occasionally I'd come across something more serious: assaults, thefts, fraud, abuse. Each time, I tried to assess them objectively, provide honest evaluations, and move on. After about a week, my point balance had reached around 500. I noticed a notification at the top of my dashboard. You are now eligible for priority validation tasks. These testimonies require experienced validators and earn additional points. There was a button, Access Priority Tasks. I clicked it. A new list of testimonies appeared, and immediately I could see these were different. The first one I opened described witnessing a murder, an actual murder, described in disturbing detail. The witness explained they'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, had seen something they weren't supposed to see, and had been living in fear ever since. The testimony included specific information about the location, the people involved, the circumstances. It read like something that should be in a police report, not on an anonymous website. I marked it as credible. What else could I do? The details were too specific to be fabricated. The fear in the writing felt genuine. I submitted the validation and moved to the next testimony. More serious crimes, more disturbing accounts, witnesses describing things they'd seen that had clearly traumatized them, things they claimed they couldn't report through official channels for various reasons: corrupt police, fear of retaliation, immigration status, involvement in illegal activities themselves. The testimonies were increasingly detailed. Locations were specific, often down to street names and landmarks. Descriptions of people involved included physical features, clothing, sometimes even names. Dates and times were precise. I kept validating them because that's what I'd signed up to do. Each one earned me more points. Each one felt more serious than the last. Then I came across a testimony that mentioned Birmingham. It described a violent incident that had allegedly occurred in Digbeth about 2 months earlier. The witness claimed to have seen a group of men attacking someone near the railway arches, that the victim had been badly beaten and left unconscious, that the witness had fled before police arrived. I read through it twice. The location was specific enough that I could picture it. I'd been to that area before, though not recently. The description of the incident was detailed and consistent. Nothing about it seemed obviously false. I marked it as credible and submitted my validation. More testimonies appeared mentioning Birmingham. Different locations, different incidents, but all local. Some I recognized the places mentioned, others I didn't. All claimed to describe serious crimes, assaults, robberies, drug deals gone wrong. All allegedly witnessed by people who hadn't reported them to police. I started wondering why so many testimonies were suddenly from Birmingham. Coincidence? Or was the system somehow showing me testimonies relevant to my location because I'd mentioned UK in my registration? Then I got a testimony that made my stomach drop. It described an incident near Cannon Hill Park, my park, the one I walk through regularly. According to the testimony, someone had witnessed a woman being followed by a man as she walked home one evening, about 3 weeks earlier. The witness claimed the man had been acting suspiciously, maintaining distance but clearly tracking the woman's movements. The witness had considered intervening, but had been uncertain whether they were misreading the situation. They'd watched the woman reach her building safely, then seen the man stand outside for several minutes before leaving. The description of the location was extremely specific. The building was described in enough detail that I was fairly certain it was mine. The date mentioned was a Tuesday evening 3 weeks ago. I walked home through that park most Tuesday evenings after my late shift. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence. Lots of women walked through that park. Lots of buildings in the area matched the description. It didn't have to be about me, but the details kept matching up. The time was right, the day was right. Even the description of the woman was vague enough that it could have been me. Average height, dark coat, carrying a bag. I marked the testimony as credible because I couldn't think of any reason to doubt it. If someone really had witnessed this and thought they'd seen something suspicious, their testimony seemed genuine. Then I submitted the validation and sat there feeling cold. Someone had been following me 3 weeks ago, and someone else had witnessed it happening. And now I was reading about it on a dark website. I checked the date stamp on the testimony. It had been submitted 2 days ago. Whoever witnessed this had waited 3 weeks before reporting it anonymously to this platform. Over the next few days, more testimonies appeared mentioning the same area. Different incidents, different dates, but all near Cannon Hill Park or the surrounding streets. Someone witnessing suspicious behavior near the entrance to my building. Someone seeing a person sitting in a parked car outside for extended periods. Someone noticing the same individual walking past the same locations repeatedly over several days. Each testimony was written by a different anonymous witness. Each described something that seemed innocuous on its own, but felt threatening when combined with the others. And I was the one validating them, marking them as credible, confirming that yes, these testimonies seemed genuine. Yes, they were sufficiently detailed. Yes, they were relevant to their stated categories. I started paying more attention to my surroundings, looking for people who seemed to be watching or following me, checking if anyone was sitting in parked cars near my building, taking different routes home, varying my schedule. I didn't see anything obviously suspicious, but then the testimonies suggested the surveillance had been subtle enough that witnesses had been uncertain whether they were really seeing something wrong. Then a new type of testimony started appearing. These ones were different in tone. Instead of describing incidents they'd witnessed, they were describing people they'd seen. Detailed descriptions of individuals, including what they were wearing, where they'd been seen, what they'd been doing. One of them described me. I'm certain of it. Average height, dark hair, works in veterinary medicine, lives near Cannon Hill Park, usually walks home around 8 on Tuesday evenings. The testimony claimed to have seen this person exhibiting suspicious behavior, though it didn't specify what that behavior was. I was being documented, catalogued. Multiple anonymous witnesses were submitting testimonies about me, and I was validating them alongside dozens of other testimonies, confirming they seemed credible and detailed. I tried to stop validating, logged out of the dashboard, and didn't go back for several days. But I couldn't stop thinking about those testimonies, about who was submitting them and why. When I finally logged back in, my dashboard had been updated. There was a new section, testimonies requiring your attention. Inside were dozens of testimonies, all flagged as priority, all mentioning Birmingham, all describing incidents near my home. And there was a message at the top. As a validator familiar with this region, your input on these testimonies is particularly valuable. Please review and validate at your earliest convenience. They knew where I lived, not just the general area, but specifically. They were assigning me testimonies about my own neighborhood, about incidents I might have witnessed, about surveillance of places I frequented. I went through the testimonies mechanically, each one describing something that had allegedly been witnessed near my home. People loitering, cars parked suspiciously, someone trying door handles on my street late at night, a person photographing buildings including mine. Each testimony was dated within the past few weeks. Each was submitted by a different anonymous witness, and each was detailed enough to be credible, specific enough to be verifiable, disturbing enough to be frightening. I validated them all because I didn't know what else to do. Marked them as credible, as detailed, as relevant. Then I submitted the validations and watched my point balance increase. The next day, I noticed someone outside my building. A woman, maybe in her 40s, standing on the pavement across the street. She was looking at her phone, but her attention kept drifting to my building. She stood there for maybe 20 minutes before walking away. That evening, a new testimony appeared. It described witnessing a woman standing outside a building near Cannon Hill Park, appearing to watch the entrance. The testimony noted the date and time. That afternoon, the description of the woman matched the person I'd seen. I hadn't submitted that testimony. I'd witnessed it, but I hadn't reported it. Someone else had, which meant there were multiple people watching my building. Some of them were the ones being watched. Others were the ones doing the watching and reporting what they saw. More testimonies appeared over the following days, each describing activity around my neighborhood, each mentioning dates and times that corresponded with my own observations. Sometimes the testimonies described things I'd seen. Sometimes they described things I hadn't noticed, but that had allegedly happened nearby. Then testimonies started appearing that described me specifically, not just vague descriptions that might match dozens of people, but specific details. My work schedule, the practice where I worked, my car, including the make and color, routes I regularly walked, shops I visited. Each testimony claimed to have witnessed me exhibiting concerning behavior, returning to the same locations repeatedly, speaking to people in suspicious circumstances, carrying items that seemed unusual. None of it was true, but the testimonies were written convincingly enough that they seemed credible, and I was still validating them, still marking them as detailed and relevant, still contributing to this documentation of my own life being compiled by anonymous witnesses. I tried to delete my account. The option wasn't available. I looked through every settings page, every menu option. There was no way to remove my account or stop receiving validation tasks. I sent a message through the site's contact system, demanding they remove my information. No response came. The testimonies kept appearing. More details about me, more specific information about my movements, my habits, my routines, all submitted anonymously by witnesses who claimed to have seen suspicious behavior. Then testimonies started appearing that described things that hadn't happened yet, predictions of where I would be seen next, suggestions of what behavior I might exhibit in the future, recommendations for how witnesses should respond if they encountered me. Someone was planning something, using this platform to coordinate surveillance, to document my life, to build a narrative that I was somehow suspicious or dangerous. I went to the police, told them people were following me, documenting my movements, posting about me online. They asked for evidence. I tried to explain about the dark website, about the testimonies, about the validation system. They looked at me like I was paranoid. They said they'd make a note of my concerns, but there wasn't much they could do without concrete evidence of harassment or threats. They suggested I keep a diary of suspicious incidents, maybe install a camera. Consider speaking to a mental health professional if the anxiety became overwhelming. I moved out of Birmingham 2 months later, found a job at a practice in Coventry, got a flat in a completely different area. Didn't tell anyone where I was going except my new employer. For a few weeks, everything seemed fine. No testimonies appeared mentioning my new location. The validation tasks I received were about other places, other people. I started to relax. Then a testimony appeared describing someone matching my description being seen in Coventry, working at a veterinary practice, living in a specific neighborhood, exhibiting the same suspicious patterns of behavior that had been documented in Birmingham. They'd found me again. More testimonies appeared. My new address, my new routine, my new regular locations, all being documented by anonymous witnesses, all being validated by volunteers who had no idea they were contributing to organized surveillance, volunteers like I had been. I stopped logging into the site, but the damage was done. My information was in their system. My life was being documented by dozens of anonymous witnesses, all submitting testimonies that painted me as suspicious, as dangerous, as someone who needed to be watched. And somewhere, other validators were reading those testimonies and marking them as credible, just like I'd done, contributing to a system they didn't understand, helping to document people they'd never met, building cases against individuals for reasons they couldn't comprehend. I don't know who's behind the witness program. I don't know what they want or why I was targeted. I don't know if I'm the only one or if there are others being documented the same way. What I know is that I helped build the system that's now being used against me. Every testimony I validated, every assessment I provided, I was training myself and others to accept these accounts as credible, to treat anonymous witnesses as reliable, to document people's lives without question. And now those same mechanisms are being used to document mine. I've moved 3 more times since Coventry. Each time, within days, testimonies appeared describing my new location. Each time, the documentation starts again. The witnesses multiply. The details accumulate. I can't escape it because I can't escape witnesses. Anyone could be one. Anyone could be watching, documenting, submitting testimonies about me to that platform. The woman at the bus stop, the man in the car park, the person walking their dog past my building. Anyone. I should say what kind of person I am, so you understand the shape of this. I work a simple office job. I have a normal rented flat on a street where the neighbors mow their front edges on Sunday and put the bins out the evening before collection. I am not clever with computers. I can use them, but I am not one of those people who talks about exploits or writes scripts. I found the dark web the way people find anything online. I read about it, then I followed a chain of instructions that were easy enough to follow if you have time and a bit of patience. I did this around the time a long relationship ended, and everything felt quieter. I had too many evenings with no reason to leave the flat, and a feeling that I could be anyone when I was behind a screen. That was the hook. Not the morbid curiosity you expect me to confess to, but the strange relief of being anonymous for a few hours and seeing if the stories matched the reality. I started with the safe-seeming corners. lists of links kept by people who claim to be archiving things. I learned the rhythm of those pages, a handful that worked, many that did not, and every functioning one mirrored in case it was taken down. I learned to recognize the names that were always on those lists without having to bookmark them. I clicked through marketplaces out of curiosity, not to buy anything. I looked at little notice boards that were trying to be communities and mostly failing. I passed through a few feeds that were supposed to be shocking and felt staged, as if the person behind the camera wanted you to believe it was dangerous when it was only a back room with bad lighting. There is a way you drift on those nights. You tell yourself that you will click one more link. Then you see a title that feels local or oddly specific, and you stretch your rule another inch. You are not intending to find anything in particular. You are not trying to be brave. You are idling with your own attention. I think that is why I kept going. I liked the sense of the world being bigger and grubbier than the daytime suggested, but mostly boring. Boring meant I was safe. I need to explain my expectations before I tell you the thread that mattered. I had read the same stories everyone reads, the ones about live streams you cannot leave once you join, the ones about people's cameras being hijacked, the ones about strangers sending things to your door as a dare. They sounded convenient, made to be retold. Every exaggerated story comforts you. It tells you the line between normal and not normal is clear. It suggests that evil is flamboyant and will announce itself with a flourish, because that is how the tale remains memorable. My experience did not present itself that way. It thickened slowly, detail after detail, until I had to admit the obvious. Someone real had taken an interest, and I had made it easy. The page that started it was nothing special. A flat background, a list of words in plain text, a row of links spaced like they had been placed by hand. The title was a variation on a theme I had already seen. A curt phrase about logistics, another about doorstep deliveries, a hint of a location that could have been anywhere in England if you squinted at it. I clicked because one of the little tags under the list mentioned the south coast, and I live not far from the sea. The first link led to a time-stamped archive of videos of front steps. Not dramatic. Short clips that were just long enough to show a parcel being left, or a little object being nudged under a mat. Nothing illicit in the footage itself. The strangeness was context. The clips had captions that summarized what had been delivered. Not what you would expect to order from a shop, but odd items you might find in a bargain bin or drawer. An ice scraper in midsummer, a packet of drawing pins, a single kitchen glove. The clips were arranged by town in a way that felt casual rather than comprehensive. I recognized one of the town names. I told myself it was a coincidence. The second link was labeled live, although I only knew that by the way the page refreshed itself. The video was a still view of a hallway with the door at the far end. The camera was low, too low for a proper security camera. It showed the threshold, a meter or so of flooring, the start of a stair carpet. To the left, there was a little cabinet with a bowl and some keys. It looked like 1,000 hallways. Nothing happened for a while. I watched because I felt strange watching a stranger's ordinary hall, and then started telling myself a story about it being staged. After a few minutes, someone walked through the frame from the stairs to the door and slipped outside. There was nothing about it that looked illegal. It looked like someone going to fetch something from the car. I clicked away and forgot it. The third link was a list of rules for something called a route. It used practical words that made it seem legitimate in a way that worried me only afterwards. It laid out expectations for those who wanted to commission a stop. It mentioned the kinds of items that could be placed and the sorts of actions that would not be allowed. It said nothing about money, It did not offer a contact. It was written as if you already knew how to reach out. I scrolled through it and closed the page. At that point, my mind had not yet collected those 3 pages into a single thought. I saw them as separate fragments in a big scrapbook of nonsense people put online to provoke reactions. A week or so later, on a warm evening that made the flat smell like dust and sun, I came home and found a padded envelope on my step with my name written in a careful, deliberate hand. There was no return address. The postage mark was smeared. Inside there was a small plastic wedge and a folded sheet of printer paper. The wedge was the sort you slide under a door to keep it open. The paper was a timetable of times and days spaced across the next week. There were only a few entries. Most of them were late in the evening. It did not look like junk mail, and it was too odd to be a flyer. I put the wedge in a drawer, put the paper in the bin, and told myself it was a mistake. That night, just after one of the times on the list, there was a knock on the door so gentle it could have been a branch tapping the frame. I did not open it. I stopped breathing until whoever was there gave up. I lay awake for a while afterwards, annoyed with myself for being spooked by paperwork. The next time I went back to that page list, it was because curiosity had turned into something else. I wanted to prove to myself that the envelope was unrelated. I wanted the comfort of randomness. I found the same list of links and went to the live feed again. The hallway was not the same as mine, and I reminded myself of that in an almost childish way, as if saying it out loud would make it truer. Nothing happened on the feed for a few minutes. Then a hand in a latex glove appeared from the very bottom edge and slid a door wedge along the skirting board until it was out of shot. The view did not change. The person had used the same kind of wedge that was in my drawer. Plenty of people own door wedges. Plenty of pranksters buy the same cheap props. I convinced myself of that and closed the tab. The second envelope came a few days later. It was thin, folded once, with no stamp. It had been pushed by hand. Inside was a cheap A4 print of a photograph of my own step, taken from roughly shoulder height. The photo could have been taken by anyone walking past. It did not show anything identifying, beyond the scuffs on the paint that I recognize simply because I see them every day. On the back of the paper, there was a scribble of numbers in pencil. They looked like the kind of code you write for yourself when you are trying to remember something. They did not resolve into anything obvious. I kept the photo and threw away the paper. That evening, I moved the little peephole camera I had bought after the first knock. I set it at an angle to cover more. I told myself this was silly. I told myself there were worse ways to spend an evening than securing a door. I would like to say I went to the police at that point. I did not. I had a photo of my own step and a knock on the door, and a wedge, and a list of times that could have been a prank. I did not want to be the person who brought that to the desk at the station and tried to explain that a web page with a live hallway had appeared on my screen without any violence in it. People imagine that if they were me, they would make the right call. They forget that life rarely presents anything as a narrative. It is more like a series of nudges that you tolerate until a line is crossed, and you do not always know where the line is until you are on the far side. I recognized my hallway on the live feed the first time I went back to it with the lights off. I am not proud of how long it took. The thing that did it was the skirting, not the furniture. There was a little length where the paint was slightly glossier, where I had brushed over a scuff some months before. It caught the light, like a faint tide mark. On the feed, the same tide mark glinted. I stared at it until I understood what I was seeing. The camera was low, at ankle height. It had a slight fisheye bend at the edges. It made the hall look deeper. I did not see anything moving for a long time. My own house looked like a set that had been built by someone who had lived in it. I switched off my lamp and stood in the hall itself and compared the way the light from the street reached across the floor with the way it glowed in the video. The patterns matched. The first thing I did after that realization was kneel by the skirting board with my phone torch and run my finger along every inch of it. I felt a tiny irregularity in the join between two boards near the step, a screw head that looked like the others but had a slightly different pattern. I prized it gently and felt give. I unscrewed it and the head came free, but the shaft did not. Inside the hole, there was a dark circle, no bigger than a pencil tip. It was flush. It did not move when I prodded it. I sat back on my heels and had the kind of clarity you only get when somebody has disrupted the quiet rules you live by. Someone had been in my hall. Someone had placed a camera. There was no dramatic flourish to it, no sign of a break-in, no wreckage. It had been done with patience and the minimum required effort. They had not come to smash or to loot. They had come to watch. You might think that I leapt into action. I did not. I felt fatigued. It is odd what fear does. Instead of making a scene, it narrows you. You start thinking about whether you should go to work tomorrow and how silly it would look to tape over a skirting board. I covered the tiny hole with a piece of card and some tape and decided to sleep on the sofa where the angle of the room was different, as if that made a difference. I lay there and looked at the shadow of the door and waited for the knock that did not come. In the early hours, I got up and checked the hallway feed again. My own body, stretched out on the sofa, was visible at the far end of the shot, barely a shape. My stomach lurched. I had not thought about other cameras. I had been so focused on the little hole by the skirting that I had not considered I might already be framed in more than one way. The logic of what to do next felt like handling fruit that bruised as soon as I touched it. I turned everything off and went to work and pretended to have a normal day. In the evening, I walked the perimeter of my own flat with my hands. I pressed fingertips along frames and under shelves. In the corner by the stair, tucked underneath the lip of the lowest tread, there was a bead of something like resin. I scraped it and a grainy dot came away with it. It looked like a dead insect until I realized it was a little hemisphere of plastic with a shine to it. Behind it, set into a drilled recess, was another lens. I put it in a mug and covered it with a tea towel, because I did not know what else to do with it. When you read this, you will want me to call someone. I did not. I took photographs of the holes and then I sat at the table and looked at the live feed again. And this is the part that I keep coming back to in my head because it was the last point where I could have chosen to behave differently. The live feed was still live. The view had not changed. The tiny dark dot by the skirting had vanished under my card, but the rest was intact. I watched the smooth stretch of my own hallway for a few minutes and saw nothing except the small movements that houses make on their own. It is strange what becomes familiar. I had become used to the idea of people seeing this view and the way a person gets used to their own reflection in a mirror. They do not like when they have no choice but to use it. Another envelope arrived the next day. It contained only a short length of duplicate key stamped with a big number that looked like it belonged to a quick-cut kiosk rather than a locksmith. It was the kind of key you get when you are in a rush and want a cheap copy to tide you over. Alongside it was a printed slip with a line of words that read like the summary you would write on a delivery docket. There were no instructions. I checked my back door and front door and both locks still turned. I put the duplicate in the drawer with the wedge and felt as if I was being trained in a process. That evening, I went back to the first page with the root rules. I read them again with new attention. I had missed a section about confirmation, not written as if it were asking you to confirm something, but as if it were telling you that confirmation would be supplied once a stop had been completed to specification. It did not name the kind of specification. It did not need to. This is where I should tell you a theory about who was doing this and why. I cannot. The whole point was not to be told. The whole point was to make you carry the logic yourself. Here is what I pieced together afterwards, which may be wrong, but fits the shape of what happened. The page had watchers and requesters. Those who watched suggested small acts. Those who requested commissioned a stop. The person or people who performed the acts were local enough to travel on foot or by bike and calm enough to be unremarkable on camera. There was no swagger to any of it. The style was administrative. A knock at a time, a wedge, a key in a drawer. Another camera set slightly higher than the first. A live feed that remained live, fed by little beads of plastic you would miss if you were not checking. It was not a sophisticated network. It was a banal process. I keep saying that word because it matters. The terror was not in the complexity. It was in the way it treated a home like a checklist. I did small things to fight back. I bought a new chain for the front door and fitted it myself, a job that took longer than the tutorials made it appear. I swapped out the back door lock with one I picked up from a hardware shop after pretending I knew what I was talking about. I set a cheap alarm that would scream if the door opened past a point. I taped over gaps. I did not call a professional because that would have meant admitting the reason, and I still clung to the hope that this was a project that would run its course elsewhere if I did not feed it with attention. I stopped checking the live feed every night and checked it every other night. I stopped telling myself I would ignore the knocks, and I did ignore them. And then one came earlier than usual, and I opened the door a crack before I could stop myself, and there was nobody there. And I laughed at nothing because the laugh had to go somewhere. The last week of it, before it broke, felt quiet. That was the trick. Nothing arrived. Nothing happened. The live view stayed the same strange fish-eye rectangle of my own hall. I slept through the night twice and woke feeling slow and grateful. On the third night, I woke to the alarm screaming and the chain yanked tight and my body moving before I had thought about moving. The door was not open. The chain had been pulled taut and then released. The cheap adhesive fixing of the chain mount had failed, just lifted away from the frame and dangled, as if someone had tested it and found it amateur. The alarm had come free too, and was squealing on the floor like a little animal. I flicked it off with shaking hands and stood in the silence afterward and had the precise thought that the silence was not a relief, it was a stage in a process. I stayed upright until morning and then went to work as if that would make the day ordinary. That evening, a final envelope. This one was stiff and heavy. Inside was a little printed card that looked like it had been cut on a home printer. It had a single line of text, just a short phrase, and a time and a date. The time was near midnight. The date was that day. I did not have to guess what the phrase meant. It belonged to the route page. It was a way of marking completion. I stood in the hall and tried to imagine what completion looked like in a process where the steps had been so minor. The answer felt obvious, because it was the thing I had been skirting around for days. It meant entry. It meant that the watching phase ended with passing across the threshold. At this point, you might tell me I should have left. It is astonishingly difficult to uproot yourself for a single night when you do not have a plan. I do not have family nearby in the way that would make a phone call easy. Friends are friends during the day. You do not wake them for something you cannot explain without sounding like you have brought this on yourself. I told myself I would sit up and be ready. I made tea and positioned a heavy lamp within reach. The live view showed my own hall. I imagined a figure appearing at the far end. I did not feel brave. I felt like a person rehearsing a story for himself, because rehearsal implies control. A little before midnight, the live feed blinked. It did not cut out. It glitched in the cheap way all video feeds glitch. A jump and a streak and a return. In that blink, the view altered. It had always been the hallway, but now the angle had shifted, as if a camera had been nudged or something placed in front of it. The near edge of the frame had a dark curve that was not there before, a shape like a shoulder, a shadow. It did not move. I stood at the doorway with the lamp raised and my heart going in my throat and waited. Nothing came through. The letterbox did not open. The handle did not turn. The waiting was the cruelty. When the knock came, it was not what I expected. It was a measured series of taps, not on the front door, but at the back. I moved down the hall and then stopped, because moving felt like stepping into a choice. I realized I was being herded by sound. I went back and stood in the middle of the hall and watched nothing happen. There is a point at which your body decides for you. The sound of metal on metal at the front door made that decision for me. It was the sigh of a key touching a lock, my new lock. The deadbolt turned with shocking ease. The door pushed forward to the chain I had refitted with proper screws that afternoon, as if the day had been a rehearsal for the night. The chain held, and then there was no pushing. The door remained a fraction open. I could see a slice of the night outside. I stepped forward with the lamp, and a second later, the chain slid back across its guide and dropped. Not ripped, lifted and guided. Hands that knew how to disengage a simple chain. The door opened the width of a palm. A foot in the dark trainer rested against the threshold for a second, and then withdrew. The door eased shut. The lock did not re-engage. I heard nothing else. The knock at the back never repeated. I stood there for what felt like an hour, and then I moved the heavy chest of drawers against the front door because I needed a symbol of resistance even if it would not hold. I did not sleep. At some point I carried the mug with the tiny lens to the sink and tipped it out and heard the plastic tap against the porcelain and put it back, and then stood looking at the hall like a person who has lost something simple and cannot remember what it was. I watched the live feed again because I am not proud. The near curve remained in the bottom edge. It felt like a sign. Whoever had placed it wanted to mark the final phase. The feed continued for a while and then looped, and the loop was subtle enough that if you were not looking for it, you would think you were seeing the present. There was a tiny flicker in a reflection that gave it away. The loop had been recorded earlier that night. I found the last camera by accident. It was set into the plaster above the door frame, hidden under a smear of paint that had been applied too neatly for me to see the difference in daylight. The lens was a pinprick. It looked like a flake in the paint. I think I only noticed it because the angle of the street lamp changed slightly as the hour passed, and the pinprick flashed a single dull star of light. I could not reach it without a chair. I did not fetch one. I could not stand the idea of standing on something with my back to the hall. I sat on the floor against the wall and counted my breaths until morning, because counting is something you can control. There are people who will say that not much happened that night. I see their point. Nobody came in and hurt me. Nothing was taken that I could itemize. What they do not understand is that my house was redefined for me. The internal map changed. Every threshold became conditional. Every silence could be part of a process. I phoned the police the next day and used careful words. I took down every camera I could find and documented each one. An officer came and looked and wrote things down. I did not show him the web pages. I said only that I had been targeted, and I was believed in the way you are believed when a stranger is polite to you and has a lot of other things to do. I replaced the front door. I changed the doors entirely rather than changing the locks. It cost more than I wanted to spend, and I spent it because the figure on the invoice felt like a replacement for a kind of certainty that had been removed. I moved not long after. It sounds dramatic, but the decision was boring. Everyone who came to view my place commented on how light the hall felt, and I smiled because I had lived long enough with the knowledge that light can be a witness as much as a comfort. I found a smaller flat on a different side of town. I did not change cities. I did not flee. I brought the chest of drawers with me, though it did not suit the new place. I gave myself rules and followed them. I do not browse the places I used to browse. I keep my browsing shallow. I have one of those chains you cannot lift from the outside. I set it every night. It is a ritual. Rituals are how you stay upright. The last thing I will tell you is the least satisfying, because there is no moral in it, and it will not resolve the itch you feel. A parcel arrived at the new address after I had been there a few weeks. It was a flat mailer, the kind that would take a magazine. It was clean, uncreased, my name written in the same careful, deliberate hand. Inside was a single photograph printed on home paper. It showed a different step, not mine, though the angle made it hard to be sure. The step had a different tile pattern and a different scuff. The photo had been taken in daylight. I turned it over, and there was nothing on the back. I looked at it until I accepted what it meant. It was not a threat. It was a receipt. It meant that the route had moved on. It meant that the process I had been dragged into was not a story about me at all. I put the photo back in the envelope and left it in a drawer because I did not want it lying around where it could be mistaken for sentimentality. I keep thinking about the wedge in the first envelope. It was such a silly object, a triangle of plastic with a rubberized strip. You use it to hold a door open so the breeze can move through, to make movement easier. It was left on my step like a prop in a school play. It made me think the whole thing was amateur. The person who pushed it under my door had practiced that movement dozens of times. The wedge was a tool and a signal. It said that what was coming would be delivered with patience and confidence and the fewest possible moving parts. People tell themselves that fear announces itself with a crash. I have learned that it prefers a knock you can ignore if you try hard enough. It chooses objects that can be explained away. It keeps your life looking normal for as long as it can. That is why it works. You might be waiting for a grand claim about the dark web at this point. I do not have one. It did not possess secrets. It provided a layout. It gave a small group of patient people a way to arrange their work, so it felt like a service rather than a crime. It dressed itself in flat language and called its visit stops and its actions completions. It shared nothing of itself. It did not need to. That is what frightened me most in the end. The total absence of ego. No monologue, no explanation. Just a set of tiny tasks that, assembled in the right order, turned a house inside out without putting a mark on anything that would show in daylight. I told myself for a while that I had been chosen because I had gone looking. That was a comforting thought in its own way. It made sense of the chain of choices I had made. It let me carry guilt in a way that had a neat border. I think now that this is a lie. We tell to create a lesson where there is none. The truth might be simpler. Most addresses can be found if you care to look. Most locks are mediocre until you decide to care. Most people will carry on with their day if you do not give them a concrete reason to stop. I am not special. I was convenient. I still check the hall before I go to bed. I still listen for the sound of a knock that is lighter than the wind. I still count my breath sometimes, although I have learned to do it in a way that my chest does not move so much, because if I can see my chest rise and fall, then I imagine that someone else can too. From time to time, I find myself at the bottom of my bookmarks, not on the sites that matter to my day, but hovering over the sort of link you keep around for no reason. I have not clicked any of those links in months. I have sat staring while the impulse flares and passes. Those are easy victories. The harder ones happen in the mundane. I have cut little slivers of card and pressed them into places where a lens would be if someone cared enough to place one. I check them on Sundays, after the mowing and the bins. They are always undisturbed. That is how normal life returns, not with relief, but with habits that in time convince you they are ordinary. I do not know what happened to the wedge. I assume I threw it out when I moved, although sometimes I think I packed it by mistake, and it is in the bottom of a box I never open. I do not look for it. I have stopped trying to interpret the things that happened with a meaning that flatters me. It was not about me being brave or foolish. It was about the fact that there are people who enjoy procedures, people who like to test a door and then withdraw and mark a tick in a column, people who prefer to be efficient rather than loud. They will always find a way to dress their work as a route. They will call it a stop and a completion, and some other unthreatening word next time. And someone like me will convince himself it is boring until it is not. If there is a lesson here at all, it is that you can live a whole life inside ordinary rooms and still be part of someone else's neat little list without ever knowing why you were chosen. I have learned to live with that. I sleep with the chain set. I wake sometimes to nothing, and I am grateful for nothing, because once you have opened your door to a process that treats you like a line item, nothing becomes a luxury that you treat with care. The photo in the drawer has curled slightly at the edges. Paper does that if you do not store it flat. Sometimes when I am looking for something else, I see the corner of it and feel my chest tighten and release like an old bruise. I think about the other person whose step it shows. Perhaps they have their own wedge in a drawer. Perhaps they spent a week checking their hallway on a screen and trying not to think about whether the loop they were watching was recorded. Perhaps the route that involved me led to a route that involved them, and then to another, and to another. It is comforting in a perverse way to imagine I was only one of many. It shrinks the story back down to its proper size. It returns the fear to its banal shape. It means that if I keep my rituals and do not invite the bigger narratives back in, I can walk from the sofa to the kitchen at night without treating the floorboards like alarm switches. When I tell this, people always want to know if I've seen anything since. The answer is boring. The answer is yes, but not in a way that makes a good ending. A few months ago, a plain card was slipped through my letterbox while I was out. It had no writing on it. It had a faint, greasy thumbprint on the corner. It meant nothing and everything. I put it with the photo and closed the drawer. I keep living here. I buy bread from the bakery up the road and complain to myself about the price and think about the smallness of the decisions that keep a person safe. I am careful what I look at, not because looking is a sin, but because looking is a kind of signal to the people who like to arrange routes. I tell you this not to scare you. Fear has its own momentum, and it does not need my help. I tell you this because all of it happened in ordinary rooms with ordinary objects, and the only unusual thing about any of it was the patience with which it was done. That is the part I remember when the house is quiet and the dark feels full. Patience is not dramatic, but it gets results. It is a better wedge than plastic. It holds a door open just enough to pass through. It started with a second-hand laptop I bought off a bloke in a supermarket car park on a drizzly afternoon, the sort of errand you wedge between buying bin liners and grabbing a reduced rotisserie chicken. I told myself it was a bargain, and I told myself I would wipe it clean as soon as I got home. I told myself a lot of things. What I did first was open the lid and have a look. My flat sits on the top floor of a tired building that looks better in rain than in sun. The hallway smells faintly of damp paint and someone's fabric softener. Inside it's just me, a sofa that never quite stopped smelling like the delivery van, a TV I bought on credit, a kitchen I keep reasonably neat, and a door that sticks in humid weather. Ordinary. The sort of place where a laptop on the coffee table looks like a sensible plan rather than a risk. The machine booted up quickly. Someone had put effort into it. There were 2 user accounts. The obvious one had a child's name and a picture of a cartoon cat. The other had a short, forgettable word and a blank icon. I clicked the cartoon cat because I assumed I would find photos to delete and documents to drag to the bin. There were holiday snaps that looked like Devon based on the sea and the colour of the sand. There were school letters and a budget spreadsheet that made me feel intrusive and then guilty. I dragged them all to the recycle bin, emptied it, and sat for a moment feeling like I'd done something respectful. I should have left it there. I should have wiped the thing properly and reinstalled a fresh copy of everything. Instead, I clicked the plain account, because it was there and because curiosity is just a polite word for ignoring your better judgment. No password. The desktop was absolutely bare apart from a single folder with a name so unremarkable it might as well have been invisible. Inside that were a handful of files with names that meant nothing unless you'd seen them before. They ended in a way that told me they were shortcut files. I understood enough to recognize where they pointed. Hidden pages. The sort people pretend are urban myths until they have a quiet evening and a drink and decide to find out for themselves. I had never gone looking for that part of the internet because it always seemed like a shortcut to either boredom or trouble. A lot of it, I had heard, was dead links and rumors. But there was something about the neatness of those shortcuts and the fact that they were sitting on a machine I now owned. I told myself I would click one, see nothing, and shut it down. That felt almost like maintenance. It felt like finishing someone else's sentence tidily. The first link didn't load. The second did. It opened to a page with a dead simple layout, like someone had copied a cheap classified site and turned the background dark for atmosphere. Titles, tiny thumbnails, location tags that used towns and counties I recognized. Not America, not somewhere far away. The sort of places I had driven through in the rain on the way to see a friend. Most of the titles were mundane in a way that made them worse. Live view of back garden, street door, flat kitchens. The thumbnails were the size of fingernails. In all of them, the light fell the way light falls in real houses where people try their best. A plant on a sill, a pile of post, a dog bed. I clicked one at random and saw the inside of a hallway with cheap laminate and a shoe rack, the sort that topples if you rush it. The view did not move unless the house moved, and every now and again someone walked past, never looking at the place the camera must have been. It made my mouth taste metallic. I clicked another. A kitchen with a pattern of tiles I have seen in 100 rentals. An oven with the brand lightly rubbed off. A kettle left too close to the edge. Nothing dramatic, just the ache of being allowed to look where I shouldn't. I told myself it was a one-off curiosity. I told myself I would shut it down. I clicked another. The third window opened to the inside of a landing with a familiar grey carpet and a thin radiator. There was a door with a hairline crack in the paint near the handle, the kind that appears when a landlord does a quick job and calls it done. The camera was angled low as if jammed into the top corner, and I felt a rush of something sour because I recognized the scuff on the skirting board. It looked too much like mine. It wasn't my landing. Not exactly. The light fitting was slightly different, and the radiator had a dent mine doesn't, but the proportions were right, and the space had that same tightness that makes you turn your shoulders when you walk through with a bag. I told myself it was the same developer, the same cut and paste layout, replicated across different towns. I told myself to stop being dramatic. Then I clicked back to the list and saw a title I had missed because the thumbnail was too dark. The title was a street name I knew well, My Street. The bit in brackets after it had my building's letter. I clicked and saw the inside of my stairwell. The camera had been fixed somewhere up near the emergency light. The lens was wide enough to catch the top of the stairs, the fire door, and the grubby patch where people rest their hands when they squeeze past someone else. I stared until my own expression looked unfamiliar reflected in the screen. The timestamp in the corner rolled forward, and in the middle of the frame something shifted. The fire door eased open and a shoe appeared, then a leg. Me carrying a bag with a loaf of bread sticking out because I never remembered to bring a proper carrier. I watched myself fumble the fob, shoulder the door, and disappear. There is no way to describe the feeling of seeing your own back in a place you thought was private. It is like having your name shouted in a crowded room in a tone that makes you want to apologize without knowing why. I shut the lid and sat very still. The room hummed with the sound of the fridge and the building's old pipework. I stood, walked to my door, opened it, and stared at the same stairwell. The same emergency light that buzzed now, I had noticed it. I looked up into the corners. Nothing obvious. I went back inside, locked the door, and looked around the flat in a way that made everything feel temporary, like a set put up for a rehearsal. Then I did what I should have done at the start. I wiped the laptop. Full reset. I told myself that was the end. It wasn't. The next morning, something small had changed. The cheap rubber wedge I used to stop the door slamming in a draft was not at the angle I always left it. It pointed inward instead of out. It could have been nothing. I left for work and tried to put it away, like you put away a bad dream by telling someone you slept fine. When I came home, the post that had been pushed through the letterbox lay in a fan pattern that didn't match the way it usually scattered. One envelope sat neatly on top. It was blank. Inside was a pay-as-you-go phone, the kind you can buy in the corner of any shop that sells fizzy drinks and scratch cards. The battery was in, but the screen was black. I pressed the button, and it woke to show a handful of missed notifications. I put it down like it was warm from someone else's pocket. I don't know at what point something stops being coincidence and starts being arranged. I picked up the laptop to feel like I was doing something active, like handling the problem with my hands might make it softer. There is a moment in all this where I keep wanting to say I should have gone to the police. I did, later. At this point, I was still hovering on the edge of convincing myself I was being dramatic. The reset had done its job as far as the machine knew. Fresh, empty, no shortcuts, no list. The cheap phone buzzed on the table. It lit with a notification in a style that looked like any other. There were no names and no emojis because there didn't need to be. I will not repeat the exact words. There were instructions without threats, which made the threat louder. There was a link that did not require any special software. I used the laptop because it already felt like the contaminated object in the room. The page that loaded was not complicated. It was a single column layout, dark background, white text, no logo, At the top, my street and building, then my door number. Below that, a live window with a view of my living room from somewhere up near the ceiling. It captured the sofa, the coffee table, the edge of the TV, and the corner where the light from the kitchen fell into the room. I stood and went to the middle of the carpet and raised a hand. On the screen, a hand lifted with that tiny delay that makes you feel like you are nodding at a stranger through a window. I looked up at my own ceiling, and my eyes struggled to stick to any one point, because now every tiny dot was a possibility. I should have run out into the hallway and shouted. I should have called out to neighbors I barely know. Instead, I moved slowly, which felt less like softness and more like not falling over. I checked behind books, inside vases, along the curtain rail. Nothing. I went into the kitchen and looked into cupboards as if a camera might sit in with the cereal. Back in the living room, I squinted into the shadow line where the wall meets the ceiling. There was a smudge so faint, I would never have noticed it on a normal day. I climbed onto a chair and reached up. My fingers brushed a small plastic dome, the size of a drawing pin head, fixed into the plaster and painted over. There was the thinnest seam around it, like the ring left by a glass. I didn't try to dig it out. I didn't want to know whether it would crumble the plaster or come away clean. The phone buzzed again on the table. The page scrolled down as if to meet me halfway. Under the live window were tiles I didn't touch at first. The headers were plain: routine, sleep, kitchen, bathroom. There was a counter that had already been counting before I arrived. There were short clips that someone had carved out of my weeks without my permission. Me making tea, me brushing my teeth, me sleeping under a thin duvet with my mouth open because my nose blocks when the heating dries the air. There were no comments. There was a tally that meant something to someone, not to me. There were pastes of my outside life as well. Me carrying bags up the stairs. Me locking the door. Me talking to a delivery driver with my hands, because I do that more than I think. The page used two words I hated immediately: scheduled and options. I shut the laptop and breathed in through my mouth until I had a grip on the shape of it. I took the cheap phone into the bathroom, ran the tap, and held the phone under it until the sound turned dull and the screen died. It made me feel like I had done something, which lasted for about a minute. Then I took the chair back to where I had found the plastic dot and pressed until the wood creaked under me, and I could get my nail under the edge of the thing. It did not crumble. It popped out with a sound like a small knuckle. There was a drilled hole behind it, with a tiny pocket of darkness. I pressed tissue into the hole and taped over it. The tissue swelled a bit with damp because the plaster was cold. I wanted to be sick. That night, I slept with the lights on. The next morning, I rang the police on the non-emergency line because the idea of explaining it without proof made me feel like I was making a fuss. The person I spoke to was kind in a way that felt like a hand on the shoulder you don't quite want. They suggested logging everything and keeping the broken device. They suggested talking to my building manager. They suggested stronger locks, better lighting, and a camera of my own. I thanked them because that's what I do when I don't know what else to do. I went to a locksmith and had the cylinder replaced. I bought a motion detector that emails you. I set it up and felt briefly competent until I remembered what I'd been looking at the day before. In the evening, I went out for bread and milk, even though I didn't need either. When I came back, the new lock turned with a satisfying click. On the mat, a small padded envelope waited with my name and the right door number in letters cut from a newspaper. It felt like a cliché until I picked it up and felt the shape of what was inside. Not a phone this time, a key. I knew the weight before I unsealed it. The old lock cylinder. My fingers went cold around it in a way a radiator can't fix. There is a point where fear becomes a practical project. I went through the flat room by room. I found another small dome above the bathroom door, painted neatly, as if someone had a spirit level. I found a thin slit in the top of the skirting behind the sofa, where perhaps a cable had been run and pulled back. Under the sink, there was a patch of cleaner paint the size of a fist. I checked the tiny cupboard that holds the stopcock and found a piece of tape with a tiny rectangle of glass stuck to it, glued inside where you would only see it if you were looking for a leak. Each discovery felt like it shrank the size of the place, as if the walls were moving in by the width of a brick with each thing I found. I stayed at a budget hotel that night, paying in cash at the desk, even though it felt performative. The corridor smelled like carpet cleaner and hot dust. I ate a sandwich on the bed and watched an ordinary program, because I needed an ordinary voice in the room. When I went to brush my teeth, there was a folded slip of paper on the edge of the basin. I had not seen it when I came in. It wasn't there when I put my bag down. It had no writing on it, just the impression of something that had been pressed hard and lifted away, like the ghost of letters. I held it under the light. The raised marks looked like the edges of a street name. Mine. When I went down to the desk to ask a question without asking, the person on duty smiled in a way that said they had been trained to handle the night. I slept badly and dreamt of corridors. The next day, my email pinged on my main phone at work. I had set the new motion detector to email me if it sensed anything. The subject lines arrived in a steady line, one after the other, each a stamped time. Movement detected, movement detected, movement detected. I did not open them at my desk. I took an early lunch and walked without tasting the air. In the doorway of my building, I paused because pausing felt like keeping a promise to the version of me that had not bought the laptop. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been. The flat smelled like crumpled plastic. On the kitchen table sat a plastic tub like the ones used for takeaway sauces. Inside it was a smear of something that once had color. Next to it lay a single glove, the kind used for food preparation. Under the glove was a photo on cheap paper. I was in it, sitting where I was now standing. The angle was from high up. The date in the corner was yesterday. In that version of the room, my mouth was slightly open. My eyes were not on anything. Behind me, in the doorway, a shape blurred as if the camera had moved. The caption underneath was not words, which somehow made it worse. It was a row of symbols like the ones used to rate films, except there were no stars, just circles and the shadow of a pound sign. I did not eat that night. I behaved like a person having an ordinary week. I took my laundry to the basket. I washed the mug with more care than the mug deserved. I watched the news with the sound low. At 2 a.m, my phone vibrated on the bedside table with the weight of a message I knew I would read. The subject line was the name of my street. The sender was nothing. The body was just a link and a short line of text that implied a schedule. I opened it because I am the kind of person who picks at a scab. The page that loaded was not the same as the first. This one was less tidy, as if whoever made it had been hurried or was copying someone else's work. At the top, a small window already playing. The camera looked down on a basement car park I recognized by the oil stain that looks like Britain. The lens shifted slightly as if adjusted. The feed cut. Another window opened to show the end of my road. The lamppost at the corner flickered the way it always does. The view shook once as someone moved past the camera. The feed cut. A final window opened to show my bedroom, as if the ceiling were made of glass. The duvet rose and fell slightly. The timestamp was in the corner. There was a visible heartbeat in the way the fabric moved. Below the live windows, blocks of text waited like items on a takeaway menu. I will not put the words here. They were suggestions, tasks, things to do to me. Some of them read like petty pranks. Some did not. Each had a value in pounds next to it, and a longer number in smaller print. The total at the bottom turned over slowly. There was no place to type. The page was not addressed to me. It was addressed to the sort of person who enjoys the feeling of rails under their feet when a train is just behind them. I closed the page and stood up too quickly, which put stars at the edge of my vision. The room tilted hard enough to make the wall look like it was thinking about letting me through. I dressed badly and left without turning anything off. The hallway felt squeezed. In the stairwell, the emergency light buzzed more loudly than it had the day before. Outside, the cold woke a slice of my brain that had been lying face down. I walked until my legs were bored and my head quietened to a functional hum. In the following days, small things rearranged themselves. My doormat turned completely around. A glass that I keep upside down over the bathroom tap to stop dust had a fingerprint on the inside. The bin had been emptied to the point where the liner sat flat at the bottom. I started staying out late and coming home suddenly, like I could catch someone in the act of not being there. The motion detector emails kept coming in clumps. The page updated whether I looked or not. I stopped looking for almost a week. When I finally did, it was because I had a calm hour on a Sunday afternoon and the quietness felt brittle. The page had changed again. There was a new section with a label that suggested things had progressed. The live window showed my kitchen. Steam fogged briefly near the hob. Then the view cut to show my front door from the inside, as if the viewer wanted me to be perfectly clear about the direction of travel. The suggestions below were shorter now. The values had crept up. The total at the bottom had doubled since the last time I watched. I scrolled down and found a new heading with a mocked-up certificate under it. It had my address and a phrase that implied the word featured. Underneath, a paragraph in plain English invited people to support the next stage if they were enjoying the show. I went to the police with a printout because something about paper makes people behave differently. I spoke with someone who had seen too much of this sort of bluntness to pretend to be shocked. They took details. They asked sensible questions. They gave advice that was ordinary in good ways. Speak to the building manager properly. Get the free security survey. Consider staying with someone. They said the words in the calm voice that people use to hold heavy things without dropping them. I left with a crime reference number and a leaflet about online safety that used a cheerful font. In the foyer of my building, one of the post boxes was hanging open with its lock broken. Inside was a stack of charity appeals and a parcel card for someone else. On the floor lay a tiny screw, the sort you need a special driver for. I picked it up and held it in my glove like it would explain itself if I squeezed hard enough. Back upstairs, my door stuck in the same place it always sticks when the weather turns. The mat was exactly aligned with the floorboards. The keys on the hook were a fraction out of place. That night I slept with my shoes on. It sounds dramatic written down. It felt practical in the moment, like filling the kettle before bed in case the water stops. At some time after 3, the room changed shape. It is hard to describe this without sounding like I am adding flourishes to make the story satisfying. The temperature didn't drop in a sudden swoop. The air didn't go quiet. None of that. I woke because of 2 things that happened close together. The first was the flat sound of my letterbox being lifted and let fall. The second was the sound of my front door finding its frame and pressing. The lock held, the handle moved. Someone on the other side knew how to wake metal without breaking it. I lay very still and did the sort of breathing you do when you are trying to be small. The handle eased back to neutral. The hush that followed had weight. Then the careful sound of a thin tool worked into a place it didn't belong. I got up in the kind of slow motion you do when you distrust your own limbs. I moved to the side of the door, thinking of the cheap peephole view you get in older buildings, that warp where everything looks fishbowl far away. The motion detector sent me an email I didn't need. The phone screen lit the room briefly and put white rectangles on the wall. The latch gave up its job in a way I felt in my toes. The door opened just enough to let nothing in. Then something narrow and patient slipped through near the floor. The toe of a shoe, a knee, a gloved hand. The figure that followed was not large. Another shape came close behind it. Both wore dark clothes that didn't try to make a statement. No masks that I could see, which made my mouth go dry. They smelled like something you buy at a builder's merchant. I had once thought about buying a baseball bat for this sort of situation. I had never played baseball, which is why I didn't. Instead, I had a heavy old spanner in the utility drawer that I never use because all my pipes are plastic. I held it in my right hand and put my left on the wall to stop the room moving. When the first person stood and reached to the inside of the frame for the chain I do not have, I moved without announcing myself. The spanner met a shoulder with a noise like someone hitting a wet sack with a plank. The person went sideways into the door, which rebounded and caught the second person's shin in a way that would make a bruise later. The second person reacted quickly, the way you do when you've hit your shin on the same thing before. A hand came up and something flashed in the low light. The heavy feeling that followed reached me before the pain. My forearm went numb and my hand let go of the spanner as if it had never belonged to me. What happened next was fast and not. The first person recovered with the annoyed efficiency of someone keen not to waste the evening. The second moved into my space in a way that suggested this was not the first hallway of the night. I went down on one knee because my legs had decided to change roles without telling me. A hand took my wrist and turned it the wrong way until it found a position that made my eyes water. Something hard pressed into the soft part below my ear to remind me to stop trying things. In my head I had arguments and speeches. In the actual corridor I had breath. They did not say anything. That is important to me, even now. They moved me just enough to clear the space. They kept me in a position that made my arms feel like other people's. One of them walked the rooms quickly, not touching anything twice, lifting in places I hadn't known to check, leaving in places I cleaned most. The other stayed with me, calm and boring in the way good tradespeople are. At some point, a phone camera made the small digital sound I will never be able to enjoy again. I refused to look at it in the way of a child who knows the answer to a question they are not ready to say. In the kitchen, a drawer opened and closed with a quiet certainty that means someone practiced. The bathroom door clicked and clicked again. The bedroom received short, careful steps, and then one heavy thump as someone tested the wardrobe anchor. Back in the hallway, sticky tape peeled and pressed near the skirting. My doorbell made a sound I didn't recognize because I never used it. The flat recorded all of this in a dozen tiny places I had not found. The pain announced itself when they were nearly finished. I became aware of my forearm, like it had stepped closer in a queue. There was a patch of heat at my shoulder, where I had made contact with the spanner handle when it bounced. My knee had a wet feeling under my jeans, where it had met a screw head in the threshold. The air smelled of tape adhesive and the sort of rubber you get on cheap tool handles. They left me in the narrow bit by the boiler cupboard, sitting on the floor with my back against the wall. The front door stood open a fractional amount, as if the building were taking a breath. There was a smear of something dark on the inside edge about the size of a thumb. I watched it develop a skin at the edges. I did nothing for a length of time that had no number. When I finally stood, everything in me argued and then did as it was told. I moved through the rooms the way a person moves through a house they are thinking of buying, even though they can't afford it. I touched nothing the way you avoid touching hot glass that looks cool. The kitchen drawer that had been opened contained my knives, which were in exactly the same order I always put them back. The bathroom felt harmless, and then did not when I looked up and saw a new dot above the mirror. Not painted, just neat. In the bedroom, my pillow had a shallow dent that matched the shape of my head too well. I stripped the bed then and there and put the sheets in a bin bag because it felt like the only thing in my power. On the coffee table, the heavy old spanner sat where it had fallen, its handle glossy with a smear that was not mine. Next to it, on the coaster I never use, lay a small rectangle of card. It was blank on one side. On the other, someone had pressed a shape into it without ink, just pressure. The shape was simple, a bell. Under it, the impression of a time that was not precise, just a range in the evening. When my doorbell rang that night at a time within the range, I did not move. It rang again the next evening, and I still did not. On the third evening, there was no bell. Instead, there was a light tapping at the kitchen window that sits over the flat roof where the bins are. I stood at the sink and listened to it. Count off my heartbeats. The tapping stopped and something light slid off the sill. I checked the page again because I am human and because you can look at something awful the way you look at a chipped tooth with your tongue. The live window showed nothing but stillness. The total at the bottom of the page had stopped. The last clip in the sequence was of me on the floor in the hallway, head turned away, shoulder high, where my arm had been arranged. Under it, a single line of text I will not replicate. It used the kind of tone people use when they are pretending to be polite in a shop. I moved a few weeks later, not dramatically. I gave notice, packed badly, and paid a man with a van who had opinions about the parking restrictions on my new street. The new place is smaller and higher up, with a view of rooftops that look like a bad drawing. I had new locks fitted the day I got the keys. I put foam in the gaps where you could run a wire. I stopped buying second-hand electronics. I bought a laptop from a shop where they ask you unnecessary questions and you answer them because you want to be the sort of person who answers questions. On the first night, I slept like a person who has spent a day lifting boxes. On the second night, I woke because a fox screamed outside, the sound of metal bending in a mouth. I lay there and told myself what it was, the shape of it, the place it came from. I almost believed myself. Sometimes, when I have a soft hour and my phone sits face down on the table and the light from the window breaks neatly across the floor, I feel a pull to check. Not because I want to see, but because not seeing feels like agreeing to something. I have resisted more often than I have not. The few times I failed, the page did not load. It timed out. It threw up an error in a box with a border. It suggested trying again later. It made me feel like I had winced in front of someone. I kept the card with the bell in a drawer I don't use for anything else. Some days I think about throwing it away. Some days I take it out and press my thumb over the raised shape until the skin shines. I do not watch the live windows anymore. I do not buy devices in car parks. I fix the wedge under my door in exactly the same way every night and check it in the morning to see if the room has breathed. Every now and again, a parcel turns up that I haven't ordered. It will be something ordinary like a set of vacuum bags or a pack of picture hooks I never meant to buy, delivered by a tired person who says nothing because I say nothing. I take them inside and put them in a cupboard in the new kitchen that I keep for things I cannot return. A drawer squeaks in a way it did not squeak last week. A screw on a switch plate looks too new. The radiator makes a click it doesn't make on cold mornings. I listen to everything the way you listen to a stranger tell a story about a place you've been. I know how this sounds. When I tell it this way, people ask why I didn't shout, why I didn't fight harder, why I didn't do the clean, heroic version. I don't have a neat ending to offer. There is no line where I stood up and frightened them off. There is no moment where I pulled out a hidden camera of my own and got the evidence in a way that satisfies the story. What I have is a stack of small moments, placed carefully, until they formed a slope I slid down without noticing the angle change. What I have is the memory of looking up at my own ceiling and meeting the stare down of a hole the width of a pencil. What I have is a bell pressed into card and a range in the evening I will always hear even when the building is quiet. If there is any use in saying it out loud, it is this. If you think your life is too ordinary to be interesting, that helps someone else more than it helps you. The pages don't need you to be special. They need you to be predictable. They need you to put your doormat down the same way every time and to go to the same shop for milk and to prop the door with a wedge when the weather turns. They need you to buy a bargain that saves you a little bit of money and a little bit of time, because there is always someone ready to spend both on your behalf. In my new place, the windows face a line of chimneys that put smoke into the sky on cold evenings. I can track the wind by watching which way it smears. The flat has its own noises, all of which I know now by heart. The kettle makes a click at the end of the boil that is almost a cough. The fridge hums in the early hours and then stops as if embarrassed. The plumbing knocks once in the bathroom at the same point in the shower every morning. I tell myself names for each sound so they feel like neighbors I have met rather than strangers on the stairs. Some nights I still sleep with my shoes on. Not often. Just enough to make getting to the door a little faster if the bell rings. I have not heard it in months. I hear it anyway. There are people who enjoy this, I think. Not in the cartoon way that's easy to dislike. In the small way, the way you enjoy making a bed neat or clicking a box on a list. People who like seeing a total rollover because they made it roll. People who like the idea of a person in a box doing what buttons tell them to do. I don't think about them much because thinking about them gives them more than they took. I think about the gaps you leave when you assume no one will use them. This is, I suppose, a confession. I am not someone who breaks rules because I want the thrill. I am not someone who goes looking for trouble. I bought a laptop in a car park because it was cheap, and because I thought I was cleverer than the sort of person who gets caught by small things. I was wrong. That is the part that sticks, not the tap on the window or the page with its sums, the part where I looked at my own stairwell on a screen in my own room and felt the world tilt because someone had been there and then stepped back without leaving anything you can hold in your hand. If you have read this far, you will have guessed the point without me having to make it heavy. Curiosity opens doors that are hard to shut quietly, and once a door has learned the shape of your hand, it does not forget. I want to tell you about the day I stopped watching those short videos. You know the ones where you just mindlessly swipe up again and again until you realize 3 hours have passed. That algorithm had me figured out perfectly until it showed me something I wish I could unsee. The moment still replays in my head, an ordinary-looking prank video that suddenly turned into something unmistakably real, something that changed me forever. I'm sharing this now because I've kept it bottled up for too long. My friends noticed how I changed afterwards, deleting all my social media, jumping whenever my phone made a notification sound. The counselor at uni thinks I'm dealing with some kind of digital anxiety disorder, but how can I tell her what really happened? She'd either think I was making it up or report it to the police, and honestly, I'm too scared to find out what would happen next. Writing it down like this, anonymously, feels safer, like I'm finally letting it out without putting myself at risk. So here goes. Last autumn, I was in my second year at university in Leeds, studying media and communications. The irony isn't lost on me now. I was living in a shared house with 4 other students, but I was always the night owl of the group. I'd stay up scrolling through videos when everyone else had gone to bed. The endless stream of content was my way of switching off after a day of lectures and coursework. I'd gotten into this habit of watching these short videos for hours before bed. You know how it goes. 1 minute, you're watching someone make a fancy coffee drink. The next, you're deep into videos of people exploring abandoned buildings or pulling elaborate pranks. The algorithm keeps feeding you more of what you engage with, and before you know it, you're in some weird corner of the internet. That night, it was a Tuesday in November. I remember, because I had a presentation the next day that I was putting off preparing for. I'd been scrolling for about an hour. It was around 1 a.m., and I was lying in bed with all the lights off, except for the blue glow of my phone. The videos had taken a slightly darker turn, as they often did late at night. I'd gone from watching cooking videos to urban exploration to pranks that seemed a bit cruel, but still within the realm of normal internet content. Then I swiped up to a video that started like many others. The thumbnail showed a young man, maybe in his early 20s, sleeping on a sofa. The caption said something about the ultimate wake-up prank on his friend. Nothing unusual there. I'd seen hundreds of these. People being woken up with air horns, water buckets, fake spiders. Internet culture thrives on that momentary fear, followed by relief and laughter. The video started with someone filming themselves walking slowly towards the sleeping person. There was no music, just the sound of quiet breathing and footsteps. The camera quality was slightly grainy, lower than the usual crisp videos that get promoted on the platform. That should have been my first clue that this wasn't from the usual content creators. As the camera got closer to the sleeping figure, I noticed something odd. The sleeping person seemed to be restrained somehow. Their wrists were at an unnatural angle beside them. I thought maybe it was just the way they were lying, but something felt off. The camera panned up to show the person's face, which had what looked like duct tape across the mouth. For a split second, I still thought it was an elaborate prank, maybe a staged kidnapping scenario between friends trying to create shocking content for views. Then the camera pulled back, and I could see the entire scene. The sleeping person wasn't on a sofa, but appeared to be on some kind of plastic sheeting on the floor. Their hands and feet were bound with what looked like zip ties, cutting into the skin. Around them was a carefully arranged set of tools, knives, pliers, what looked like a blowtorch. This wasn't a prank video. This was something much worse. The video lasted only about 30 seconds total. The last few seconds showed the person behind the camera reaching down and selecting a knife, then the bound person's eyes flying open in terror as they realized what was happening. Then the video ended abruptly. I stared at my screen in shock. For a moment, I wasn't sure what I'd just seen. There's a part of your brain that tries to normalize even the most disturbing things. I told myself it was just a really dark prank, or maybe a clip from a horror film, or an elaborate setup for a viral marketing campaign. I even swiped back up to see it again, to reassure myself it wasn't what I thought it was. But the video was gone. In its place was a cooking tutorial. I scrolled back down, looking for the video, but it had vanished completely. I closed the app and reopened it, but my feed was back to showing the usual content. Nothing remotely resembling what I'd just witnessed. I put my phone down and sat up in bed, my heart racing. Had I imagined it? Was I so tired that my mind had twisted an innocent prank video into something sinister? I almost convinced myself that was the case, that I needed to get more sleep and stop scrolling through videos until the early hours. But then my phone vibrated with a notification. I picked it up, half expecting to see a message from one of my housemates asking me to quiet down. Sometimes I didn't realize how loud I was being when everyone else was trying to sleep. Instead, it was a notification from an app I'd never seen before. The icon was just a simple black dot. The notification just said, "Enjoyed the preview. Swipe for more." I immediately deleted the notification and checked my installed apps. There was nothing there that matched the black dot icon. I ran a virus scan, which came back clean. I restarted my phone, changed my passwords, all the things you're supposed to do when something seems off with your device. By the time I finished, it was nearly 3 a.m., and I managed to convince myself that it was just a glitch. Maybe an ad for a horror film that had somehow made it through the platform's content filters. The next day, I was exhausted during my presentation, but managed to get through it. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. What would I say? That I might have stumbled upon something disturbing but wasn't completely sure. That I got a strange notification afterwards that I couldn't explain. It sounded paranoid, even to me. For a few days, everything went back to normal. I still used my phone but avoided the video app. I focused on coursework and spent more time with my housemates in the evenings instead of isolating myself with endless scrolling. I almost forgot about the incident. Then, about a week later, I received an email from an address that was just a string of numbers and letters. The subject line was blank, and the body of the email contained only a link. Against my better judgment, and I still don't know why I did this, I clicked it. The link took me to what looked like a clone of the popular video app, but something was off. The interface was slightly different, with a dark grey background instead of white, and instead of the usual categories and trending topics, there was just a continuous feed of videos that started playing automatically. These weren't normal videos. Each one showed someone in distress, bound, crying, pleading silently with the camera. Some were being pranked in ways that went far beyond anything that could be considered a joke. Being burned with cigarettes, cut with knives, terrorized with weapons. And between each distressing video were clips of normal, everyday content. The exact kind of videos I usually watched, from creators I recognized. I tried to exit the page, but it wouldn't close. I tried closing the browser, but it reopened itself. In a panic, I forced my phone to shut down by holding the power button. When I turned it back on, everything seemed normal again. The browser history showed no record of the site I'd visited. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what I'd seen and what it meant. Had I somehow stumbled into some dark web version of the popular video platform? Was there a shadow version of the app that showed content too disturbing for the mainstream? And more terrifyingly, how had it found me? The next morning, I woke up to another notification from the Black Dot app that wasn't installed on my phone. This time it said, "Your viewing habits have been analyzed. Recommendations ready." That was when I knew this wasn't random. Whatever this was, it had been watching what I watched, learning my preferences, my viewing patterns, just like the main algorithm, but for something much darker. And somehow, it had decided I was ready for more extreme content. I didn't open the notification. Instead, I did a factory reset on my phone, wiping everything. I changed all my passwords from my laptop, set up two-factor authentication on every account. I even changed my email address and phone number. Paranoid, absolutely. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been marked somehow. For a while, it seemed to work. No more strange notifications, no more disturbing videos. I still use social media, but was much more careful about what I engaged with. I set time limits for apps and never used them late at night when my guard might be down. Then came the package. It arrived at my house about a month later, addressed to me but with no return address. Inside was a USB drive and a printed card that said, "Custom content based on your viewing history." I didn't plug in the USB drive. I'm not that stupid. But I didn't throw it away either. Something stopped me. Some morbid curiosity, or perhaps the feeling that discarding it wouldn't make this go away. Instead, I wrapped it in plastic and buried it in a shoebox in my wardrobe. Sometimes, late at night, I think about what might be on it. Videos tailored specifically to what the algorithm thought would appeal to me, based on everything I'd ever watched, every video I'd lingered on a second too long, every dark curiosity I'd indulged thinking no one was watching. It's been 6 months now. I've changed universities, moved to a different city. I use technology as little as possible, just enough for my studies and to stay in touch with family. No more social media, no more endless scrolling. But I can't escape the feeling that I'm still being watched, that the algorithm is still learning, still waiting to show me more. Every CCTV camera, every smartphone, every laptop camera feels like an eye following me. And the worst part is knowing that whatever I saw that night, whatever dark corner of the internet I glimpsed, it's still out there. People are still scrolling through it, still being fed content that gets progressively darker, still being desensitized bit by bit, until suddenly they're watching something real and horrific without even realizing the line they've crossed. Sometimes I wonder how many other people got the same recommendations I did. How many clicked through? How many watched more than I did? How many are still watching? And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if I'm in one of those videos now too. If someone, somewhere, is swiping through short videos and will come across footage of me going about my day, oblivious to the camera following me. And they'll pause for a moment, thinking it's a bit odd, a bit different from the usual content, before swiping up to the next video. Never realizing what they've just seen or what might be coming next. Just another swipe in an endless stream of content, getting darker with every flick of the thumb. So this is going to sound like nothing for a while. I want you to know that up front, it's going to sound like a fairly ordinary account of a fairly ordinary woman living a fairly ordinary life in the north of England. And you're going to wonder where the horror is, and then you're going to find it. And when you do, I want you to remember that you thought it was nothing. That's the point. That's always been the point. My name is Rachel. I'm 32. I live in a mid-terrace in Harrogate that I bought with my ex-boyfriend 3 years ago and kept after we split, because I could just about cover the mortgage on my salary, and because the alternative was moving back to my mum's in Ripon, and I love her, but I couldn't do it. The house is on a quiet road about 15 minutes from the town centre. 2 bedrooms, a small garden. I've been meaning to do something with since the day I moved in, and haven't. It suits me. It's mine in a way that nothing had been mine before, not completely, and I'm attached to it in a slightly embarrassing way that I've stopped apologizing for. I work in marketing for a company that makes industrial filtration systems, which is exactly as interesting as it sounds. I write copy about products I will never fully understand for clients who need to feel confident in things they've already decided to buy. It pays well enough, it's mostly remote, and it allows me the kind of quiet, structured working day that suits my temperament. I like routine, always have. My ex said I was boring, which was partly true and partly just a thing people say when they've stopped finding you interesting and want the fault to live somewhere other than in themselves. My two closest friends are Becca, who I've known since university and who lives in Leeds, and my colleague Jess, who I see less often now we both work from home, but who I speak to most days. I have other friends, in the looser sense, people I see for birthday dinners and occasional Sunday pub lunches, and whose company I enjoy without feeling essential to. I go to a yoga class on Tuesday evenings. I run along the Stray on Saturday mornings when the weather allows. I read a lot of crime fiction and feel slightly guilty about not reading more literary novels, and never quite get around to rectifying this. I am, by any reasonable measure, a contented and well-adjusted person living a full and unremarkable life. I need you to have all of that in your head before I tell you anything else. The fullness of it, the ordinariness. Because what happened didn't happen to someone isolated or vulnerable or at a low point. It happened to me, in my house, in my ordinary life, on an otherwise normal Tuesday in February. And the fact that it could happen in those conditions is the thing that has stayed with me longer than anything else. It started with a link. Becca sent it to me on a Wednesday evening in January, in a WhatsApp message that said, "Only have you seen this," followed by a string of laughing emojis. The link was to a Reddit thread, one of those compilation posts where people share strange or unsettling things they've found online. I read it with half my attention while the television was on, the way you consume most things on your phone after 9 in the evening. It was mildly interesting. A few entries were genuinely odd. I replied to Becca with a screenshot of the one I'd found funniest. We exchanged a few more messages, and I put my phone down and went to bed. What I didn't do in that first session was reach the bottom of the thread. I went back to it the following evening because I was procrastinating on a piece of copy that wasn't coming together, and my brain needed something low stakes to do for 20 minutes. I read further this time, past the entries I'd seen the night before, into the later comments where the contributions became progressively more obscure. Most of it was still in the register of internet curiosity. Strange websites, odd subcultures, the kinds of digital corners that exist for no apparent reason but are ultimately harmless. And then, about 2/3 down, someone had posted a link with a description that was vague enough to be intriguing and specific enough to be unsettling. The description said only that it was a forum, that it was invitation only, that someone had got hold of an invite, and what they'd found inside was unlike anything they'd described before. I clicked it because I was procrastinating, and because the description was well written, and because I am, despite everything, curious by nature. The link resolved to what appeared to be a standard-looking forum interface. Muted colors, plain text. The kind of design that hasn't been updated in years and doesn't need to be, because function is the point, rather than appearance. There was a registration page. I didn't register. I read what was visible without logging in, which was limited. A few thread titles, some category headings, nothing that revealed much about the content. The thread titles were odd, not explicit, not immediately alarming, but odd in the way that certain things are odd when the language is slightly off, when the register doesn't quite match what the words appear to be saying. I closed the tab and finished the copy and went to bed. The yoga class that Tuesday was good. The instructor had put together a sequence that was genuinely difficult in the right places, and I drove home afterwards with that particular physical contentment that comes from having used your body properly, pleasantly tired, thinking about nothing more significant than what I was going to eat when I got in. The road was quiet. The house was warm. I made pasta and watched something on television and read for an hour before bed. I slept well. I always sleep well. The next day was Wednesday, and I had a call with a client in the morning that went better than expected. And Jess and I had a long debrief about it over a video call that made us both laugh. And in the afternoon, I finished a piece of work I'd been chipping away at for a week and felt the clean satisfaction of completion. I ran a bath. I rang my mum. I was in bed by 10 and asleep before 11. Thursday, I went back to the forum. I'm not going to pretend I don't know why. The thread titles had stayed with me in the way that certain things stay when your brain hasn't finished with them, turning them over at the edges of other thoughts. I told myself I was going back to look properly, to satisfy the curiosity and move on, which is what you tell yourself in these situations. I registered with an email address I use for mailing lists and nothing important. Chose a username that had no connection to anything real about me and got in. The forum had perhaps 30 active threads across several categories. Most of the categories were vague. Discussion, resources, recommendations, which could have meant anything and turned out to mean very specific things once you read into them. I spent about an hour reading without contributing, moving through threads in the way you move through a new environment, getting a sense of the geography before committing to any particular direction. The community had its own language, abbreviations, references, shorthand that assumed shared knowledge, the kind of internal vocabulary that develops in any closed group over time. I didn't understand all of it on that first session. I understood enough to know that what the community was organized around was the documentation and discussion of real-world harm, not hypothetical harm, not fiction. Events that had happened or were happening, recorded and shared and discussed with the analytical interest of people who had developed a framework for this that placed it outside the register of ordinary moral consideration. I closed the laptop at about 11 and sat on the sofa for a while. Then I reopened it and kept reading. The Saturday run was good, cold but dry, the Stray empty enough at 8 in the morning that I had long stretches of it to myself, the trees bare against a pale sky, my breath visible, my mind clearing in the way it clears with sustained physical effort. I ran further than usual, closer to 8 miles than my standard 5, and came home feeling scraped clean, which was what I needed. Becca came for lunch on the Sunday. We sat in the kitchen with the heating up and talked for 4 hours about everything and nothing. Her job, her complicated situation with a man she'd been seeing, my ex, whether I was going to do anything with the garden this year. It was the kind of afternoon that reminds you why certain friendships matter. The ease of being known, the absence of performance. She left at 5, and I waved her off from the doorstep and felt genuinely, straightforwardly happy. That evening, I went back to the forum and found a thread that had been posted while Becca and I were having lunch. The thread was in the discussion category. It was structured around a specific event, something that had happened, the poster said, within the past week in the north of England. The details were partial and deliberately vague in places, but the location references were specific enough to be identifiable if you knew the area. I knew the area. I had grown up 20 minutes from the place being described. The event itself, and I am going to be plain about this without being gratuitous, because the details are necessary, and because dressing them up would be its own kind of dishonesty, involved a woman, alone, in her home. What had happened to her was described in the thread with the same analytical, slightly detached register I'd been reading for 2 weeks, clinical in its precision, interested in the methodology rather than the person. There were photographs. I won't describe them except to say that the photographs were real, and the woman in them had not consented to any of what they showed, and what had been done to her was thorough and deliberate, and had clearly taken a long time. The thread had 27 replies. The replies were not expressions of horror. They were expressions of interest, questions about specifics, requests for additional material. One reply, posted that afternoon while Becca and I were talking about the garden, asked whether there was footage as well as photographs, and whether it could be shared to a specific subforum I hadn't found yet. I closed the laptop. I sat in the kitchen where 4 hours earlier I'd been happy in an uncomplicated way that now felt very far away. And I thought about the woman in the photographs, and I thought about the north of England, and I thought about the 20 minutes between where I was sitting and where the thread said it had happened. And then I thought about the last 2 weeks, the registration with the throwaway email, the username with no connection to anything real. I thought about whether that was actually true, whether the account was as disconnected from me as I'd assumed when I created it, whether I actually knew enough about how these things work to be confident of that. I opened the laptop again, not to read, but to think through what I'd done and what it meant, and whether I had, in 2 weeks of curious and increasingly absorbed browsing, left any trail between the throwaway account and the person sitting in a terrace in Harrogate who knew exactly how far 20 minutes was from where that woman had been photographed. I thought about the thread titles I'd found odd on that first evening, the register that was slightly off. I understood now what the register was. I understood that I had been reading for 2 weeks the ongoing documentation of real harm committed against real people. And I'd kept going back, and the community I had been reading had systems in place for the vetting of new members that I hadn't found yet and didn't fully understand. And I did not know what information they had gathered about me in the process of allowing me access. I rang the police at 9:10. I was on hold for a while, and then I spoke to someone and explained what I'd found, what the thread contained, the location references, the photographs, the date. They took it seriously. I gave them everything I could, the URL, the thread title, my account details, all of it. The woman in the photographs was identified. She was alive, which I learned 3 weeks later from a follow-up call I'd asked for, and which the liaison officer said was unusual to share, but that she felt, in this case, was warranted. She had been found. She was receiving care. The investigation was ongoing. I deleted the throwaway email account the same night I made the call. I don't know if that was the right decision or whether it destroyed something that might have been useful. I made it because I needed to do something concrete, and that was the thing available to me. It's been 8 months. The yoga class is still on Tuesdays. I still run the Stray on Saturday mornings when the weather allows. The garden is still unfinished, and I've accepted that I'm probably not a garden person, and that's fine. Becca still comes for lunch occasionally, and we still sit in the kitchen for 4 hours talking about everything and nothing, and those afternoons are still the thing they always were. What's different is smaller and harder to name. It's a quality of attention I carry into ordinary things now that wasn't there before. A knowledge about what exists, what is documented, what is discussed in certain places with a casualness that I still find, 8 months later, almost impossible to fully absorb. I knew in the abstract that terrible things happened and that some people organize their lives around the commission or consumption of those things. Knowing it in the abstract is entirely different from having spent 2 weeks reading the specific language of those people, the particular way their interest presents itself on a page, the ordinary sounding sentences in which extraordinary harm is discussed. The woman in the photographs is alive. I repeat that to myself sometimes when the knowledge gets heaviest. She's alive and receiving care, and the investigation is ongoing, and I made the call at 9:10 on a Sunday evening 8 months ago, and those facts are real, and they matter. What I can't fully resolve, and I've stopped trying, mostly, is the 2 weeks before the call. The evenings I went back, the hour on the Thursday, the session after Becca left, the accumulation of sessions between the first link and the Sunday night when everything became undeniable and I picked up the phone. I wasn't looking for harm. I wasn't seeking out content of that kind. I was curious, and then I was absorbed, and then I was in something I hadn't seen the edges of until I was already well inside it. That's the part that stays. Not the horror of what I found, though that stays too, but the ease of the path in. How unremarkable each individual step was. How little any single evening felt like a decision. How thoroughly ordinary my life remained on either side of those sessions. The yoga, the run, the client calls, Becca in the kitchen, my mum on the phone, while I was reading things that had no business existing in the same world as any of that. The house is still mine. The road is still quiet. I still sleep well mostly. I just know things now that I didn't know in January, and some of them I'd give a great deal to unknow. And the option to do that has never been available and never will be. That's the deal, I suppose. That's what curiosity costs you when it takes you somewhere you weren't equipped to go. I was the one who found the website. That's the part I can't forget, no matter how hard I try. A few years later, and I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about that night in the hostel and how everything changed when Emily started screaming. I've never spoken about this to anyone, not even to the friends who were there that night. I'm writing this down because keeping it bottled up is slowly destroying me. My girlfriend says I talk in my sleep, muttering about turning it off and just a video. She thinks it's from stress at work, but how do I tell her what we all saw that night? How do I explain that somewhere out there, those videos are still being made, still being watched, and we all just walked away and pretended it never happened? This happened during my gap year after sixth form. I'd been backpacking around Eastern Europe with money I'd saved from working at my local supermarket for 18 months. By October, I'd made my way to Prague, staying in this massive hostel that was popular with British and American backpackers. It was the kind of place where you could always find someone to go drinking with, where people passed through for a few days before moving on to Berlin or Vienna or Budapest. I'd been there about 4 days when I met this group of British students, 2 guys and 3 girls, all from different universities who'd met while traveling. They seemed cool, and we clicked right away over cheap beers in the hostel's common room. They were like most backpackers you meet, open-minded, adventurous, looking for experiences they could tell stories about when they got home. Stories that would make their friends envious of their gap year adventures. On my 5th night, after the hostel bar closed at midnight, we were all a bit drunk, but not ready to sleep. One of the guys, Tom, suggested we go back to their room to keep drinking. They had a 6-bed dorm all to themselves, so there was plenty of space. I remember thinking it was just going to be another night of swapping travel stories and maybe planning a group outing for the next day. The hostel was one of those converted old buildings with thick walls and creaky wooden floors. Their room was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a long hallway lit by these dim yellow lights that made everything look slightly jaundiced. When we got to their room, Tom pulled out his laptop and a bottle of local vodka someone had bought earlier. I should mention that at this point, I still thought this was going to be a normal night. Maybe watch some YouTube videos, share music, typical backpacker bonding stuff. I had no idea Tom was into the dark web, or that he'd been showing the others crazy videos he found there over the past few nights. While Tom set up his laptop, connecting to the hostel Wi-Fi through some VPN he was using, he started telling me about these insane gore videos he'd found. He explained how you needed special browsers to access these sites, how everything was anonymous, how you could find anything if you knew where to look. I remember feeling uncomfortable, but also curious. I'd heard about the dark web before, but had never seen it. The others were clearly already familiar with this routine. They arranged themselves on the bunk beds around Tom's laptop, passing around the vodka bottle. The room was dimly lit, just one small bedside lamp on, which made the laptop screen seem extraordinarily bright. I sat on one of the lower bunks, feeling increasingly uneasy, but not wanting to seem like the prudish one of the group. Tom navigated through what looked like a normal forum, except everything was styled in black and red. The site had a name that was just a string of random letters and numbers. He explained they curated the best extreme videos from around the web. I remember how casually he scrolled through thumbnail images that already looked disturbing, even at that small size. Emily sat beside me on the bunk, while Sophie and Anna were on the opposite bunk. The other guy, Dave, was sitting on the floor next to Tom. There was this weird energy in the room, a mix of nervous excitement and discomfort. Nobody wanted to be the one to say this was too much. Tom clicked on a video titled something like Workshop Fun. The player expanded to fill most of the screen. What we saw started like some kind of amateur horror film. Poor lighting, shaky camera work. Someone in what looked like a workshop or garage. There was a person tied to a chair, wearing what appeared to be a bloody Halloween mask. At least, that's what I told myself it was. The camera moved around this person, showing various tools laid out on a table nearby. Everything looked staged, but in a disturbing way that was trying too hard to be shocking. Tom and Dave were making comments about the fake blood and how you could see the strings when the camera zoomed in. I wanted to believe them, that this was just some extreme version of those fake prank videos you sometimes stumble across online. But then the camera angle changed, and we could see the person's face clearly for the first time. The Halloween mask wasn't a mask at all. It was a real person, gagged and terrified, with what looked like cuts and burns already visible on their face and neck. That's when Emily made this strangled sound next to me. At first, I thought she was just reacting to how graphic the video was turning. We all felt sick watching it. But then she grabbed Tom's arm so hard he spilled vodka on himself. She kept pointing at the screen, not speaking, just making these awful, choked sounds. Tom paused the video, annoyed at first. Emily was shaking, tears streaming down her face as she tried to form words. Finally, she managed to tell us that she recognized the person in the video. It was someone from her hometown, a girl who had gone missing during a backpacking trip through Eastern Europe almost 6 months earlier. The room went completely silent. Tom immediately closed the laptop, but it was too late. We'd all seen it. We'd all recognized the moment Emily had. This wasn't some fake gore video made for shock value. This was real footage of a real person who had really gone missing. What followed was chaos. Sophie started crying. Dave was saying it couldn't be the same person, that Emily was mistaken. Anna was frantically texting someone on her phone. Tom just sat there staring at his closed laptop like it might explode. I felt physically sick, like the floor was tilting beneath me. My mind kept replaying that moment when I realized we weren't watching a sick prank or an amateur horror film. We were watching someone's actual suffering, someone Emily knew personally. And the timestamp on the video was from 3 months ago. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Tom reopened his laptop. Instead of going back to the video, he started deleting his browsing history, clearing caches, removing whatever software he'd been using. His hands were shaking so badly he kept mistyping. Dave was helping him, both of them muttering about IP addresses and how we could all get in trouble for accessing the site. Emily wanted to go to the police, but Tom and Dave were adamant that we couldn't. They argued that we'd be implicated for accessing the dark web, that we could be considered suspects since we'd clearly been looking for violent content. Sophie sided with them, terrified of getting in trouble. Anna just kept saying we should leave Prague immediately. I just sat there, paralyzed with indecision. Part of me knew Emily was right. We had to report what we'd seen, but another part was selfishly worried about the consequences. Would I be detained in a foreign country? Would this follow me forever? Would my parents find out I'd been watching disgusting videos on the dark web? In the end, we made a decision that haunts me every day. We agreed to say nothing. Tom completely wiped his laptop, even running some program that supposedly overwrote the hard drive multiple times. We all swore to never speak of it again. The next morning, the group checked out of the hostel. I stayed another day, unable to face them at breakfast. Emily had been crying all night. I could hear her through the walls. When I finally left Prague, I went south instead of east as I'd planned, wanting to put as much distance between myself and the memory of that night as possible. But here's the thing I can't stop thinking about. Someone is making those videos. Someone is filming them. Someone is uploading them. And people like us are watching them, telling themselves it's not real, that it's just extreme entertainment. Until that night, I could pretend the dark web was just an urban legend, a story about a hidden part of the internet where terrible things happen. But I've seen it now. I've seen how thin the line is between curiosity and complicity. I've seen how easy it is to become part of something horrific without even realizing it until it's too late. Sometimes I look up the case of the missing girl from Emily's hometown. There's still a Facebook page dedicated to finding her, run by her parents. They post updates on the anniversary of her disappearance, begging for information. They don't know what happened to their daughter. They don't know that 7 strangers in a Prague hostel saw her final moments and said nothing. I don't know what happened to the others after that night. We disconnected completely. No social media, no exchange numbers. It was like we all wanted to erase each other along with the memory. But I wonder if they have the same nightmares I do. I wonder if Emily ever went to the police on her own. I wonder if Tom still browses those sites, telling himself it's all fake. And I wonder about something else, something that keeps me awake at night. When Tom was scrolling through that site, I saw dozens of thumbnail images of other videos, dozens of other victims. How many of them were real people with families searching for them? How many disappeared without a trace, only to end up as entertainment for people like us, drinking in hostels and looking for a thrill? I still travel sometimes, but I never stay in hostels. I can't stand the thought of those communal spaces, those rooms full of strangers, all with their own secrets and browsing histories. Every time I see someone hunched over a laptop with their screen angled away, I wonder what they're watching. Every time I hear about a missing backpacker, I think about that night. The dark web isn't some separate world that exists apart from ours. It's here, bleeding into our reality every day. People disappear, videos appear. And somewhere in Prague, in a hostel room that's been cleaned and rented thousands of times since that night, 7 people became part of something they can never undo, no matter how hard they try to delete it. I've spent the last 4 months trying to convince myself it was all just a horrible coincidence, but I can't keep pretending anymore. I work as a graphic designer for a small marketing agency in Leeds. Pretty standard stuff. Logos, web layouts, social media graphics. Nothing groundbreaking, but I enjoy it. I've always been interested in new tech, especially anything related to art and design. When AI image generators first became popular last year, I was immediately hooked. Spent hours experimenting with different prompts, seeing what the algorithms could create. It was fascinating how they could combine concepts in ways I'd never think of. Like most people, I started with the mainstream AI art sites. You know, the ones where you type in a prompt and get back something that looks vaguely like what you asked for. They were fun for a while, but I kept hitting the same limitations. Content filters blocking anything remotely controversial, long queues for image generation, restrictions on commercial use. That's when a colleague mentioned there were more advanced AI art generators on the dark web, ones without the safety filters, trained on unrestricted datasets. As someone who works with visual content professionally, I was curious to see what these unfiltered systems could create. That curiosity would turn out to be the worst mistake of my life. I wasn't completely new to the dark web. I'd browsed it a few times before out of curiosity, but never went beyond looking at marketplace listings and forums. I knew how to access it safely. At least I thought I did. I set up my VPN, fired up Tor, and started searching for these underground AI generators. It took a couple of evenings of browsing through forums and following links, but eventually I found what I was looking for. A site called Deep Dream. Not its real name, obviously. The interface was bare bones compared to the mainstream sites. Just a black background with a text input box and a few settings options. No account required, no email verification. The only unusual thing was that it asked for cryptocurrency payments per batch of generations, about £10 worth of Bitcoin for 20 images. I paid the fee and started experimenting. At first, I kept my prompts similar to what I'd use on mainstream sites: fantastical landscapes, cyberpunk cities, abstract concepts. The results were impressive, sharper, more coherent than what I was getting elsewhere. There was something off about some of the images, strange anatomical distortions, unsettling facial expressions, but I attributed that to the lack of safety filters. After a few nights of casual experimentation, I started getting more adventurous with my prompts. Nothing illegal or pornographic, but definitely pushing boundaries. Dystopian scenes, dark surrealism, body horror concepts that would be useful for a horror project I was working on as a side gig. The results were disturbing but fascinating from an artistic perspective. One night, about 3 weeks into using the site, I was home alone in my flat working late. It was around 2 a.m. and I'd had a few beers. Probably not the best time to be exploring the darker corners of AI art, but my inhibitions were lowered. I decided to experiment with prompts about pain and suffering, thinking I might get some interesting abstract representations that could inspire a series of graphics for a metal band's album cover. I typed in extreme human suffering, realistic, detailed, high resolution, and hit generate. What came back made me physically recoil from my screen. Among the batch of 10 images were several that looked like standard AI-generated depictions of torture. Disturbing, but obviously artificial, with the telltale inconsistencies you expect from AI art. But one image stood out. It didn't have the usual AI artifacts. The lighting was consistent. The anatomy was perfect. It showed a young woman tied to a chair in what looked like a basement, her face contorted in pain, with bruises and wounds that looked disturbingly specific and medically accurate. My first thought was that this must be a real photograph that had somehow been included in the training data. But that didn't make sense. It doesn't just regurgitate exact images from its training set. I stared at it, feeling increasingly uneasy. There was something about her eyes that seemed to be looking directly at the viewer, pleading. I decided to try again with a similar prompt to see if I'd get more photorealistic results. This time I tried human captive in pain, realistic, photograph quality. The new batch loaded, and my blood ran cold. There was another image of what appeared to be the same woman, but from a different angle with different injuries. The setting was identical. Same basement, same chair, same rope bindings. My hands were shaking as I tried one more prompt. Basement torture victim close-up, realistic. The results included 3 more images of the same woman, in progressive states of injury. The final one showed her unconscious or worse. This couldn't be coincidence or some weird AI amalgamation. These looked like stills from a continuous sequence, like frames extracted from a video. The consistent lighting, the progressive injuries, the identical setting. It all pointed to something too coherent for AI to randomly generate. I closed the browser immediately and stepped away from my computer, feeling physically sick. My mind was racing with horrible possibilities. Had I somehow stumbled upon evidence of an actual crime? Was this AI being trained on footage from the dark corners of the internet that should never see the light of day? Or worse, was someone using this platform to distribute real footage disguised as AI-generated content? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe this was an elaborate hoax. Maybe the site was seeded with realistic images to shock users. Maybe it was from a movie or staged horror photography that looked more real than it was. I spent the next day distracted at work, unable to focus on anything but those images. That evening, I made the decision to go back to the site, not to generate more images, but to see if there was any information about how their model was trained or who operated the site. I needed to understand what I had seen. When I tried to access Deep Dream again, the site was gone. Just an error message where the page should have been. I tried searching the forums where I'd originally found the link, but any mentions of the site had been deleted. It was as if it had never existed. Now thoroughly disturbed, I decided to search news sites for recent missing persons cases involving young women. I didn't know what I would do with any information I found, but I felt compelled to look. After about an hour of searching, I found a news article from about 6 months earlier about a university student who had disappeared after a night out in a city about 40 miles from where I live. The article included a photo. It was her, the woman from the images. Same distinctive eyebrows, same small scar on her chin. I felt the floor drop out from under me. This wasn't some elaborate prank or synthetic image. I had been looking at evidence of an actual abduction and worse. My hands trembled as I bookmarked the article, my mind racing with what to do next. Should I go to the police? How would I explain finding these images? Would they even believe me? Before I could decide, I received an email notification, a new message from an address I didn't recognize, just a string of numbers and letters. The subject line was simply curious. There was no text in the body, just an attachment. Against all better judgment, I opened it. It was an image of me sitting at my desk, looking at my computer screen. It had been taken through my window from outside my flat. In the corner of the image was a timestamp. It had been taken less than an hour ago. I shut down my computer, pulled all my curtains closed, and spent the night on my sofa with a kitchen knife beside me, jumping at every sound. In the morning, I called in sick to work and went to the police station. I told them about finding disturbing images online that I believed could be related to the missing student case. I didn't mention the dark web or the AI generation site, just said I'd found them while browsing an online forum. I showed them the news article I'd found. They took my information, but didn't seem particularly interested. They explained that they get dozens of tips about missing persons cases, often from people who think they've seen something online, without the actual images or specific information about where I'd seen them. There wasn't much they could do. I couldn't show them the images because the site was gone. I couldn't tell them exactly where I'd seen them without admitting to browsing parts of the dark web I shouldn't have been on. I left feeling frustrated and scared. When I got home, I found another email from the same address as before, this time with a different image. Me at the police station, entering the building. The message read, "Not smart. We know what you saw. We know where you live. Forget about it." I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I changed all my passwords, covered my webcam, and kept my curtains closed at all times. I considered moving, but what good would that do if someone was already watching me? A week later, the local news reported that the body of the missing student had been found in an abandoned building. The cause of death wasn't disclosed, but the police were treating it as a homicide. They were asking for any information from the public. I should have gone back to the police then, should have told them everything. Consequences be damned. But the day the news broke, I received a package at my door. No postmark, no return address. Inside was a USB drive. When I plugged it in, it contained a single image file. Me, asleep in my bed, taken from inside my bedroom. That was 3 months ago. I've since moved cities, changed my name, deleted all my social media. I don't use AI art generators anymore. Don't browse the dark web. Don't even use the same programs or websites I used to. But I still feel watched, still feel like I'm being followed. I don't know who was behind that website or what their purpose was. Maybe it was a way to distribute evidence of real crimes disguised as AI-generated content. Maybe it was a trap to find witnesses they could silence. Maybe the images themselves were bait to identify people who would search for more. All I know is that somewhere out there, someone knows what I saw, and they know who I am. And every time I hear a noise outside my window or notice someone looking at me too long on the street, I wonder if they found me again. So if you're ever browsing the darker corners of the internet and come across something that doesn't seem quite right, something too real, too specific, too coherent, close it immediately. Because sometimes what looks like an algorithm's creation is actually evidence of something that was never meant to be discovered. And the people who don't want it discovered will go to any lengths to keep it that way.